Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us today for this special event on this special day. As most of you know, 18th of March marks the 7th anniversary of the Syrian Revolution. The day, it's a very significant day for Syrians. I think it's the most significant day in Syria's modern history and most probably in the modern history of Middle East and beyond. The world we live in will never be the same after the Syrian tragedy. This tragedy continues to unfold as we are speaking right now in the most violent ways, like we see in the massacre of Eastern Ghouta and the brutal attack on Afrin. Over the past 7 years, every time we thought we have seen the worst of it, we were met with the new levels of brutality, moral failures, and shameful lack of action by the international community. So, should we still expect even more degrading treatment by the civilized world? Unfortunately, there are enough signs to make me believe that this is the case. The voices of decision makers calling for the rehabilitating of Assad and accepting that he will stay in power sound today louder than the voices calling for an accountability for the war crimes he did. The discussion in closed meetings and conferences about reconstruction in Syria seems to overshadow the discussion about achieving real political transition in the country. So how did we arrive to such a miserable reality? And where are we heading from here? These are the questions that we are trying to address today with our guest speakers, who we are lucky to have here today. Writers, journalists, and experts and academics who have a deep knowledge about the Syrian context. And I'm honored really to welcome them today. They are mentors and dear friends. Thomas Pierret, Kristin Helberg, Yassin Saleh, Nicolas, Hénin, and soon we will be joined by Bassma, Kodmani, and Mazen Darwish. Before we open the first session, I want to thank Allianz Kulturstiftung. Without their support, we couldn't make this event. I want also to thank the Volksbuhne Theater and the Salon staff for hosting us today. I think, personally, it's more than a coincidence that we are holding this event in the heart of Berlin's most iconic theater, a theater that was built in 1914 to achieve the vision of Freie Volksbühne, or Free People Theater. And today, the theater itself is in the middle of fierce debate over a big transition that it's undergoing. Finally, I want to thank my friends and comrades, Yassin Saleh, Yasmine Merei. The idea of this event came while the three of us were sitting and thinking, what can we do to honor the memory of 18th of March? It took us only a few minutes to figure out that let's do something that could hopefully provoke a serious debate about our complicated present and ambiguous future. I believe one of the few meaningful things we can do today is to be less nostalgic, less rhetoric when we speak about our burning country. Instead, let's try to ask new questions and to engage others in these questions. So let's start, and thank you very much again for joining us today. We'll open the session with Kristin Helberg. Briefly, I will introduce Kristin, a journalist and political scientist. She studied in Hamburg and worked for the NDR before moving to Damascus in 2001. For 7 years, she reported from Syria to German, Austrian, and Swiss media. Now she lives in Berlin, and she's author and expert on Syria and Middle East, on the Syrian and the Middle Eastern affairs. She wrote 2 books. Sorry, I will call the titles in English because my German is horrible. The first book is Focus Syria Insight to an Unknowable Country. The second book is Distorted Perspectives, Syrians with Us, about fears, misunderstanding, and a changed country. The third book, which we are all waiting for, it will be soon published in July 2018, called The Syrian War, Solving a World Conflict. So, Kristin Helberg, please.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. My intervention has the title, Letting the Syrians Down Comes at the Price of World Disorder. So I will try to connect a little bit international dynamics with what is happening on the ground in Syria. What we see right now is an escalation inside Syria. Everybody was thinking that things would calm down, the war would come to an end, but it's actually escalating, not only internally, which no one really cares about, what's happening in Eastern Ghouta, Afrin, Idlib, even now Dara, we know everybody's watching, but it is escalating on an international level. And this is really getting scary for people even in the West, escalation between Turkey and the US over the Kurdish issue. Russian mercenaries are being killed by American soldiers in Deir ez-Zor, and Israel and Iran clash in Syria. So let's use this international attention to ask ourselves where we are right now and where are we heading. I want to make 5 arguments. My first argument is, yes, the Syrian regime is winning the war militarily. It will regain control of Eastern Ghouta, of the so-called de-escalation zones, Eastern Ghouta, Idlib, Dara, parts of Homs and Hama, and Assad will stay in power. But in reality, he already lost this power to the people who keep him there. There are 4 factions. There are 2 external actors, Iran and Russia, and 2 internal actors that are Syrian militia leaders, warlords, who profit a lot from this war, who are not interested in peace in the first place, and the fellow businessmen of Bashar al-Assad, his cronies, who profited from this war and are now really expecting to gain a lot more through reconstruction. So the people he is dependent on are not interested in social welfare or justice or freedom or reconciliation, but they really look at Syria for personal enrichment and to increase their power even further. So what appears on the surface to be stability, because there's less bombing maybe, and people reopening their shops, is a piece of the grave. People might be safe from air attacks, but they are not safe from militias, from the intelligence agencies, mukhabarat, from arrest and torture, from expropriation, and from expulsion. So Syria under Assad will continue to be a centralist, totalitarian, and arbitrary state, which means that the circumstances that spawned the rebellion 7 years ago are still present. Injustice, oppression, corruption, clientelism, nepotism. And some of them even were exacerbated even further by the war economy and by foreign influence. So what Syrian society really needs, stability without fear, reconciliation, accountability, justice, is inconceivable with Assad and the people who keep him in power. My second point is Syria, the chessboard. We used to call this conflict a revolution, an armed uprising, a civil war, and then a proxy war, when foreign powers intervened for their own interests. But this war by proxy is no longer driven by internal Syrian dynamics, but by different priorities of external actors, as there are 5 of them. I want to name 5. Russia wants to get out of there because it's really getting expensive. They want to manage Syria from far, and they want to, or they need to seal diplomatically what they invested militarily. This is why Putin needs a political settlement to convince the Americans, Europeans, and the Gulf countries to pay for a settlement. But Assad has no interest at all in a political solution, even less than ever when he can have a military victory. The US they fought against ISIS in the first place. This was the first priority. Now they want to weaken Iranian influence. That's basically their only goal by now. So they are staying in the northeast right now with their Kurdish allies. Washington wants to play some role in a settlement, but there is neither a clear understanding nor a strategy for Syria. Turkey wants to put the border region with Syria under a durable Turkish influence by installing and supporting pro-Turkish militias or rebel groups. They already did so north of Aleppo, between Jarablus and Azaz. And Erdogan might in the end really prefer Assad's troops or pro-Assad militias at the border than as long as these people prevent the PYD or YPG from governing an autonomous region there. Iran established a deep and long-term presence inside Syria in terms of military, politics, economics, and society. Its area of influence really stretches now from Iran to the Mediterranean, bringing Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon under effective rule of the Revolutionary Guards, which of course bothers Israel. They won't accept Iranian militias at their borders with Syria. And they will not hesitate to attack Iranian or Syrian military infrastructure whenever they feel threatened. So I would argue that this Syrian conflict is no longer a proxy war. It is a world conflict on Syrian soil in which Syrian groups are only junior partners that serve the interests of their foreign sponsors. Which brings me to my third point. Everybody intervenes. Everybody's meddling in Syria, but no one cares for Syrian civilians. Never has. To be clear, I strongly oppose any foreign military intervention for regime change, as we saw it in Iraq and Afghanistan. For me, the only justified intervention is the protection of civilians on the basis of R2P, responsibility to protect. So for years, Western countries were reluctant to impose no-fly zones, no bombing zones, humanitarian corridors, protection zones. But at the same time, yes, they were ready to intervene in Syria against ISIS. So instead of stopping the bombs, they decided to bomb themselves. The German government really played a very negative role there because they would argue, for the implementation of a no-fly zone, we definitely need an international mandate. But when we had the Paris attacks in October 2015, it took them just a couple of weeks to send German tornadoes to Syria without a UN mandate. So for us Europeans, it's okay to bomb in Syria without UN resolutions. But for the protections of civilians, yes, we do insist on a UN mandate. Talking about ISIS and Daesh, dealing with terrorism by military means only will never lead to a lasting victory, because ideologically ISIS is not defeated. So in Syria, ISIS really was a byproduct of this war. It was enabled by Assad's ruthless war against his moderate opponents, by the ignorance of the international community, because fighting jihadi terrorism, while at the same time turning a blind eye to state terrorism, produced even more radical young men who would join the terrorists. So as long as the root causes of this war are not properly addressed, extremism will flourish and terrorist groups will just re-emerge. This hypocrisy and these counterproductive measures that we saw continuously by the West could be avoided by following the golden rule for Syria, or the golden rule in Syria, which is not only goes for Syria, obviously. Look at the people outside, people in different places, living in different realities inside the country. Ask yourself how these people feel, how they understand how they think, study their perceptions. Think about why opinions change. Watch carefully how they are affected by what you do or what you fail to do. Because without taking into consideration the perceptions of the people inside Syria, we will not understand the conflict and we will never solve it. My fourth point, new world disorder. What happens in Syria, I think, is a complete failure of the international community and its institutions. And Syria really has become the symptom of a new world disorder in which the established mechanisms that we built up during the last decades don't work anymore. Think of the UN and their agencies, think of the Geneva Convention, think of the International Criminal Court. They all don't work. They all fail to do anything in Syria. Because we kept on, having declarations and strong condemnations of the atrocities, but nobody really did anything about it. So this gap between words and deeds marks the end of Western credibility, which wasn't very distinctive in the first place. So by maintaining this rhetoric on one side, saying, oh, this is terrible, Assad has lost legitimacy, we have to build a new Syria, blah, blah, without being ready to implement this or to provide the means to implement this, Western politicians have had to continue this war. They would promise rebels, they would promise political opposition groups to continue the fight against Assad without the proper means to do so, which was just a prolongation of the suffering in the end. By now, Europeans and Americans are paying a high price themselves. We all do. Think of the refugee crisis, think of integration efforts, think of the deepening cleavages in our societies by now. Think of right-wing parties in Europe, think of authoritarian regimes, think of Austria, think of Italy. So it's all related to the Syrian war somehow, which will be remembered as a historic failure of our age. And it's the starting point of a new world disorder that feels more insecure, more inhuman, more undignified, because crimes against humanity are being committed with impunity. And any leader of a country can do whatever he wants to stay in power as long as he only kills his fellow countrymen. So the conflict in Syria is not reaching its end, it's just entering a new phase, I would argue. What does this mean for us in Europe? What does it mean for us in Germany, maybe? Will Syrians be able to return anytime soon to their home country? I think it depends. People who are sitting in tents with children who don't attend school might consider to go back in case they have a place to go back to in the first place. Everybody else, Syrians who are in Europe, they have a bearable existence in a safe place, will not go back anytime soon, especially when they are opponents of the Assad regime. So if the German government has the declared interest, to send Syrians back to their country, they should work or stand up for a different Syria. So this is what we should do. And we, I now talk about we as Germans, as Europeans, or as human beings as a whole. First of all, as we failed to help the oppressed for 7 years, at least we should not help the oppressor now. No normalization of relations with the Assad regime, no reconstruction with Damascus, because Assad's reconstruction serves neither the economic restoration of Syria nor its social reparation. For the regime, it's a tool to reward his supporters and to punish opponents and to cement demographic changes. Without the will to protect civilians, I think we shouldn't engage militarily at all. Germany should end its military intervention there. And the money we save, we should use to help Syrians who are displaced in Lebanon and Jordan. We should use it for the integration of Syrians in Germany, and we should send it to the federal public prosecutor in Karlsruhe, because Berlin should adopt a leading role in the legal prosecution of war crimes committed in Syria. Because we have this universal jurisdiction principle, Weltrechtsprinzip in Germany. German courts can try crimes committed in Syria in German courts. We have overwhelming evidence. We have charges, investigations, and already some witness interviews. So international arrest warrants against high-ranking representatives of the regime we should see them as soon as possible. Because without justice, there won't be peace. And without peace, people will not go back. The last thing we should do is to keep on supporting or even step up the support for activists inside and outside Syria to strengthen civil society engagement, because actually, hopefully, these people are the ones that will someday shape a democratic Syria. So what Syria needs right now is a clear stance towards the regime, which is not about Assad personally, but about the system behind him. Because only when the security apparatus has been disempowered and those primarily responsible for the crimes committed, Syrians will draw hope and return. And until then, we should just promote their integration in Germany, for example, by enabling them to bring their families to join them here, because I think, after all, much of their experience in Germany, in Europe, could be useful in a post-Assad Syria someday. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristin. Thank you very much for the comprehensive keynote. Our second guest speaker, Thomas Pierret. Let me introduce Thomas briefly. He's senior researcher in Aix-en-Provence University, South France. He holds PhD in political science from the Sciences de Paris University of, pronouncing correctly? Yeah, okay. And he was a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh between 2011 and 2017, and a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton University and Zentrum Moderner Orient in Berlin. His research concerns issues of authority and ideology in Sunni Islam, as well as the organization of and alliance strategies of rebel fractions in Syria conflict. He's author of a brilliant book, Religion and State in Syria, the Sunni Ulama from Coup to Revolution, and a co-author of Ethnographies of Islam. Thomas, please.
Thank you very much, Mohammad. Thank you for inviting me. To start with, I hope you won't mind if I quote something you once told me, actually 7 years ago, when I called you during the summer of 2011, so after several months of demonstrations against the regime. And at the time, I mean, things were not going very well because the regime was cracking down. It was starting to send tanks to different cities in the country. And you told me a sentence I always remember. You told me, I'm optimistic because optimism is a political stance. Perhaps you remember that. Up to you, but I find it, I was very positively impressed by it. I really liked it. I'll try to, in this extremely bleak picture we have today, I'll try to speak about some positive developments, or at least some parts of the picture that are a bit less bleak than the rest. I'd like to speak about the resilience and the continuing relevance of revolutionary symbols in the face of the jihadi groups' attempts at imposing their ideological hegemony over the opposition and the insurgency at large. When Aleppo fell to the regime in late 2016, I was expecting actually this defeat to have the impact of radicalizing, ideologically speaking, the entire opposition, because the fall of Aleppo was primarily a defeat for the mainstream opposition, and it was in a way vindicating the jihadist discourse. Your allies have abandoned us, and so on. And in a way, that forecast I made was wrong. It's true that last year what we've seen, and I'll be speaking mostly about the northwestern part of Syria under the control of the opposition, so what we call the greater Idlib area. It's true that we've seen, generally speaking, the former Nusra Front, which is now called the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, we've seen them expanding militarily at the expense of other rebel groups. But what's interesting is that at the same time, at the discursive and ideological level, we've seen them in a way on the back foot. And I will explain what I mean by that. So, starting in 2 years ago, exactly, in early 2016, what was then the Nusra Front started issuing statements with a new language. At least for them, it was a new language. And they were speaking about the blessed Syrian Revolution, which they had never done in the past. Because in the past, they were never even using the term revolution. It was like a dirty word for them. Such a dirty word that they actually had to publish a 30-page treaty to explain why it was okay to use the term revolution. The Nusra Front, until then, had been speaking about the jihad in the land of Sham, not the Syrian Revolution. Revolution was problematic for them because it was a Syrian revolution, inside Syrian borders against the Syrian regime. Starting in 2011, it was supposed to stop after the fall of the regime, whereas for jihadis, jihad is something that started decades ago in Afghanistan. It's supposed to last until they establish world hegemony, so it's not at all limited to the borders of Syria. And it's not supposed to stop after the fall of Assad, if it ever happens. Also, what they didn't like about revolution was that revolution was something made by the people. And people is also kind of a dirty word for jihadis. They think that the people who have the legitimacy to act and to lead the struggle are the vanguard, the jihadi vanguard themselves. Okay, they're the righteous, not everyone, which everyone by definition includes good and bad people in their view. And this opposition between the concept of revolution and the concept of jihad, it's been symbolized by two flags. Revolutionaries have adopted what they call the revolutionary flag, which is the pre-1963 national flag of the Syrian state, whereas jihadis opposed to this flag, opposed the so-called Islamic banners, black or white, with the profession of faith in calligraphy on it. So that's why I call this talk a war over banners, because we've seen many demonstrations where inside Syria where jihadis would torn apart the flag of the revolution that was waved by revolutionaries. And yet, as I said, by 2016, the jihadis, at least some of them, started to change, not their mind, but at least their discourse about it. And what we've seen a few months ago, they even made a step further by remote controlling the establishment of the so-called Syrian Salvation Government, which is this civilian, allegedly independent government that's supposed to administrate civilian affairs in the province of Idlib. So it's supposedly independent. It's not. It's very much controlled by Tahrir al-Sham, but at least they pretend it is. And that's interesting because it's called a Syrian government, so they're acknowledging the fact that there is something called Syria. It's allegedly civilian, and yeah, it has adopted the flag of the revolution, this government. And this idea to have a civilian authority to manage civilian affairs is also a very significant break with the traditional jihadi approach to governance. I mean, jihadis like to administrate things very directly, like the Islamic State did in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, for instance. Of course, this change of approach with Tahrir al-Sham is not, I'm not at all saying that it's sincere, that they have changed their mind. It's a very pragmatic move, driven by external and domestic considerations. Externally, they knew that once they would become the leading military force in Idlib, which happened last year, the rest of the world would start looking at Idlib as a sort of new jihadi emirate, like the defunct proto-state of Daesh, and that there might be an international action to destroy them. So that's why they established this administration to show the world a civilian face. Okay, Idlib is actually administered by civilians, so you shouldn't attack them. So it was a way to protect themselves, also a way to make dealing with Turkey easier. Like cross-border discussions on technical issues. Turkish officials had to deal with the civilian authority instead of dealing with Tahrir al-Sham, which is problematic. But there are also internal or domestic considerations here. I mean, the Tahrir al-Sham has realized that these revolutionary symbols still have a symbolic capital. They remain quite powerful, and their idea was that by using them, they would be able to attract new supporters and delegitimize their rivals. It happens in a context where most other mainstream rebel factions are participating in peace talks, either in Geneva or Astana. So in a way, they're on their way to abandon the revolutionary struggle. And Tahrir al-Sham comes up and says, in fact, we are the last genuine defender of the revolution. Why is this revolutionary discourse, why does it still have some potency after 7 years of conflict? Interestingly, it was not always the case. And in particular, in 2013, these revolutionary symbols, the flag of the revolution and so on, they were really witnessing a very marked decline. Most rebel factions, including non-jihadi factions, were adopting a discourse that was increasingly hard to distinguish from that of jihadi groups, properly speaking. It was a context of radicalization, sparked by developments like the intervention of Hezbollah in the conflict, the Ghouta chemical massacre, the rise of the Islamic State. So this had the first step was that this led to radicalization of the rebels. But then, when jihadis, first the Islamic State and then the Nusra Front, started to attack other rebel groups, then we witnessed the emergence of a critique of not just these particular groups, but jihadi ideology in general. The shift, perhaps, is best illustrated by a campaign that started on Twitter in March 2015 and then turned into an underground campaign called Raise the Flag of Your Revolution, where people were asked to demonstrate, wave the flag of the revolution, and that was very much as a kind of anti-jihadi symbol. It was initiated by civilian activists, but one of the reasons it was quite successful was that it was backed by all sorts of other people, including religious scholars, and some military rebel commanders who showed up on Twitter with pictures of the revolutionary flag. And since then, since it's been 3 years now, but the revolutionary flag has very much been the symbol of protests against the hegemonic ambitions of the Nusra Front. It's not just a symbolic matter. It has also some consequences on the ground. If you take the example of the town of Attar, west of Aleppo, civilian resistance under the revolutionary flag has been a key factor in pushing Tahrir al-Sham out of the town a few months ago. And over the last weeks, we've seen also battles between Tahrir al-Sham and other rebel groups, which work very much hand in hand with civilian protesters to push Tahrir al-Sham out of certain regions, with more or less success depending on the location. I'm coming to the end here with just two conclusions. I think it's important to emphasize the fact that when we see jihadi factions expanding on the ground, that doesn't mean their ideology is expanding with them. It doesn't mean they expand because they're popular. I know many of you know that, but it needs to be reminded. Jihadis usually expand because they're superior in terms of military organization and skills, not necessarily because they have more popular support. And second, it's interesting also to emphasize that the brutalization of the conflict has not necessarily resulted in the radicalization of the entire opposition. And that was because revolutionaries or genuine revolutionaries were able to push back against the jihadis' ambitions, at ideological level at least. To the extent that, as I explained, the jihadis had to adjust their discourse to formally accommodate certain revolutionary symbols and principles. Now, I started on an optimistic note, and I'll finish perhaps with a more pessimistic one. It's not because revolutionary symbols have been resilient and even underwent a revival in recent years that it will last forever. The future might be bleak, especially now at the time we're seeing that most non-jihadi rebel factions are either destroyed or neutralized, so pushed out of the struggle. And there is a very real risk that in the end, what we will see is, seeing the jihadis becoming the only game in town, which has always been the dream of the jihadis and of the Assad regime, of course. Just yesterday, allegedly, the Islamic State took a position from the regime in the desert, killed some Hezbollah commanders. So, of course, that's very dangerous. That might lead, eventually to the obsolescence of these revolutionary symbols. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for this precise and informative intervention. And because, just briefly, I want to say that you highlighted an important point, because generally the discourse here in the West, or I would say the common discourse, especially among leftists, that the anti-Assad rebellion movement is dominant mainly by al-Nusra, and that al-Nusra has really, strong roots in the Syrian community. And it's not the case for anybody who knows anything about Syria, actually. And this is just one way to show it, that there is, it was a battle on two fronts. The revolutionary or the civil resistance. In some areas, they were resisting the oppression of the regime, and also the growing oppression of the new authority, which is the jihadis or al-Nusra. So it's very informative and very important to highlight this today. Our next guest speaker, Yassin Saleh. Yassin, you want to go to the podium or from here? Here? Okay. So I will briefly introduce our dearest Yassin. Born in Raqqa, Syria in 1961, was a political prisoner between 1980 and till when, Yassin? 96. So it's 16 years. Okay. For being a member in a communist party opposing Assad regime. He's the author of 6 brilliant books on Syria. Syria from Under Shades, Insights from Within the Black Box in 2009, The Myths of the Successors, A Critique of Contemporary Islam, and A Critique of the Critique, 2011. Salvation, Oh Guys, 16 years in the Syrian prison in 2012, and Walking on One Leg in 2012 also. Culture as a Politics, Intellectuals and Their Social Responsibility in the Time of Monsters, 2016, and the must-read book, in my opinion, The Impossible Revolution, in 2017. He has been awarded with the Prince Claus Prize in 2012. Currently, he is a fellow at Wissenschaft Kolleg in Berlin. Please, Yassin.
Thank you, Mohammed. Well, I'll begin with a warning. This talk is titled Overactive Inaction, and it is a bit angry and bitter. So Syria has been setting a global political paradigm that is bound to manifest itself here and there, donning our country the indubitable honor of being the future of the world. The way the struggle in Syria has been administered for 7 years by influential global powers manipulating local groups, among whom the regime is a group, one of these groups, the regime itself, and playing original sensitivities and rivalries, is already affecting the whole world, as Kristin rightly said. Those powerful who engineered the infernal genocide going on in Syria are, in a way, engineered by it. Also, as Kristin said, they are really hurting themselves while not avoiding to help us. With their leverage to affect, it is eroded, to affect the situation, eroded more and more. Why? What happened? I tend to think that those who were once able to stop the huge crime have kept asking themselves for 7 years, should we care for those massacred in Syria, killed by torture? Not under torture. Torture has become a method of mass killing in the country. Killed by torture, barrel bombed, gassed, raped, displaced, and cleansed. And it seems that the answer was negative. They did not find it in themselves to protect the unprotected, who asked for protection and help all the time. Again, why? My answer is because there is an invisible force that has rendered the lives of those killed, those Syrians killed, cheap, rendered their lives cheap. Something related, this invisible force is related to hierarchies of peoples, cultures, religions, a force that enables those in power to relegate those at the bottom to extermination as a method to discipline all the others, including the others in the West. It happens that those killed in Syria occupy the contemporary global bottom. They are Arabs, Muslims, Sunnis, and they don't make a minority. This invisible force has a name, racism. And it is a structural force that proves to be essential to contemporary global governance. And because it is structural, those at the top cannot control it, even when it contradicts their vital interests, as is happening today, and as Kristin again showed. Islamophobia is only one aspect of this force, whose constitutional action is to divide the governed on the global level and to empower those who are already powerful. I mean, Islamophobia is not against Muslims. It is as much against non-Muslims. Anti-Semitism in the past was faithful to the Jews, but it hurt Jew haters as well. White supremacy does not empower precarious whites who elected Trump 15 months ago. It really disempowers the color, but it doesn't empower those precarious whites. For those at the top, it is okay for local whites, I mean Bashar al-Assad, his junta, to kill 100 a day of the blacks, but maybe not 1,000 or 1,466, as happened the morning of August 21, 2013. Because this, why? Because this irrationality endangers all the system. It is okay to have an active industry of transgressing biological borders or boundaries of detainees and killing camps as well, but not to break the political borders of the civilized world and arrive in hundreds of thousands in Europe in what can be a postmodern archetypal example that millions dream of imitating. Let them stay there. Let them just disappear from our sight. Inaction is an extremely misguided term and to describe the way Western powers dealt with Syria. It is not at all inaction, and this I don't agree with Kristin. Apart from the fact that their policies have been always committed to reproduction of the same hierarchy of people, of cultures, of religions, they have been active in so many ways, intervening all the time actually, but not in a way that helps those struggling for change in the country. They were complicit in the Russian criminal occupation and destruction of Syria. The way these governments dealt with Hitler 80 years ago, because they thought that Putin will only kill those they don't like. I should not recall to your memory the despicable chemical deal again. I still think, I mean the American-Russian deal, only 3 weeks after the chemical massacre. I still think it's a turning point in the world history. But maybe one should mention that Americans, French, and British have now boots on the ground. We were accused of inviting those imperialist powers to have boots on the ground. Actually, they have since September 2014. They have boots on the ground. I mean, for more than half of the 7 years of the Syrian struggle, Syrian Revolution, Syrian genocide, they have boots on the ground. So the inaction was active one, an active one, indeed overactive, though ethically and even politically blind, though it is turning self-destructive even to the Western power, and Kristin mentioned many examples of this self-destruction. This is because of the invisible force behind this alleged inaction, racism, I insist. When one looks to the course of 7 years, she or he is struck by the fact that all this killing has been possible. Displacing almost 6 million has been possible. Chemical massacres have been possible. Barrel bombs have been possible. But stopping the mass atrocities has proven impossible. This is really quite a dangerous world. The invisible has symptoms, and these symptoms have tongues. The tongues happen to say that fascism is not really a bad political system for those at the bottom. They will kill each other without thuggish fascist junta that monopolizes their legitimate killing. You know that the Middle East is very complicated region. People are not rational there as you may think, and their irrational primordial struggles have been flowing from age-old feuds going on for thousands of years. Obama said this almost literally. Extreme violence is not strange to their political culture. So what they really need is not elected governments, but heavy-handed regimes that can provide those precious commodities, security and stability. That's why we don't want their states to be dismantled, especially the state's security infrastructure. And this security infrastructure, this is an expression in Hillary Clinton's book, Her Choices. It is not that by doing so we are electing those genocidal juntas for them. It is only that we help their real political nature to express itself freely. Syria is setting a new global political norm in the meaning that fascists with necktie are good, not only as opposed to fascists with bars, but also as opposed to those mobs who wanted to own politics and for their voices to be heard. The only problem is that elegantly suited strong men can be really excessive and reckless. They kill their black subaltern in ways that cause instability. Bashar is evil, albeit the lesser evil for us. Hopefully, Putin will discipline him against the greater evil. The latter is by no means Daesh. It is those uncontrolled black Syrians struggling to change the system, those who want to elect for themselves. This is a genocide with international patronage or sponsorship. Someday we may see this huge crime written in the hierarchical system, and its inherent racism. And this is a Middle Eastern copy, which is centered on stability, centrality of Israel's security needs, and exception from international laws. And actually, another exception, epistemological exception, but from humanities. But now that the time is one of subaltern rebellion, it is time of denial from the side of the masters as well. They say, the denial says, it is their struggle. Alas, we can do nothing. And actually, we did our best to stop it. This is very Freudian, 3 contradictory statements. And an outright lie, as was proven at least by the chemical deal, among so many other examples. Of course, the example even known more that they are really at war now in Syria, and they have boots on the ground, as I have just mentioned. The most recent example of racism as a method of a global governance, a method of a global to divide the world. It is not an accusation. I target only those governments with it. It is like totalitarianism in Syria. It is a method of rule. It is a strategy of politics there. The most recent example of racism as a method of a global governance is a topic that's being pushed up to the head of the agenda of political debate about Syria now. Reconstruction. The world wants to reconstruct us while still denying our political agency, and while the genocidal perpetrators are still doing their job. We are told that our deaths are meaningless, which implies that our lives are meaningless as well. Well, this is racism, and it is the crudest expression. I guess many people tend to think of this bitter statement as another blame game of the losers. I am speaker of the losers, one of their speakers, hopefully. Maybe, for one, I think that we Syrians are really blamable for lacking courage and self-confidence to defend our meaning and agency, and to call genocide, genocide, and racism, racism. We are in the world now. This is a big revolution. We are in Berlin and everywhere in Europe. And this is a big revolution, and it will have unpredictable global effects. One of them is our owning a horrible story of death rendered meaningless, which is a global metaphor, not only for us, for all the subaltern everywhere in the world. The world, at the same time, the world is in Syria, and this is a big counter-revolution, which is not against Syrians only. I think it's also against the world. And the effects, the bad effects are already happening, as again Kristin mentioned, that will have unpredictable global effects as well. It is a story of rendering death meaningless. I mean, the presence of those influential powers in Syria. It is a story of rendering death meaningless and life as well. To conclude, it is all not about Syria, what I want to say. It is about the world. The world is sick, and the sickness is in the head. The illness situated over there in the Middle East, but the remedy is not. It's global. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yassin, for this honest and angry statement. So I have loads of questions, but I will allow myself just one question for each of our guest speakers, and then we'll open the floor for you, audience, to if you have questions, and also for our speakers if they have questions to each other. I will start with Kristin. Kristin, I just personally, I think I was fascinated by the way you described Syria today as a chessboard for world conflict. So I want to ask you, this morning, the Turkish troops, of course, with their Syrian allies, they took over Afrin. So the attack is almost done now, over. But my question to you, because you are also close observer to the Kurdish-Turkish, dilemma and what's happening in northwest Syria, what do you think is next for Turkey after Afrin? And do you see any serious disagreement or maybe even clashes between the Turkish-backed forces and the American-backed forces in these areas? Because it's so contested and it's so complicated now. And can we see the two allies in NATO now like really standing in opposite trenches or fronts, or they will find ways to solve this?
I think both of them have no interest in a direct confrontation, and I think there will be, or there are already ongoing talks between the Americans and the Turks to not really escalate over Manbij or even farther east. But I really want to stress something different. I think the case of Afrin and what happened there is really, in different ways, a perfect example for this dynamic that I wanted to stress. Because you see that really the Syrians have turned, the Syrian groups have really turned into agents of foreign intervention. And I really don't want to make it too easy for the Syrians here, because we all agreed on this, meddling and intervention, and I very much agree what Yassin said. It's not that there's inaction. No, everybody's taking action, but for his own interest only, so nobody taking care of civilians. So the case of Afrin is very interesting because Turkey has, to an extent, manipulated or influenced the so-called FSA, Free Syrian Army, north of Aleppo, that are being now sent to Afrin to fight there against their own countrymen, Kurdish countrymen. That this is for me really the symbol of the, complete descendants, or what would you call it? the corruption or the Syrian resistance being corrupted completely by foreign actors. If this is what is left of the Free Syrian Army in Afrin, there's nothing left, to be honest. This is really the fall of the Free Syrian Army. When you remember how they were greeted, by the demonstrators, is now really laying in rubbles, to my understanding. And then we go back to the war of the banners. Look at the Free Syrian Army banner. This was the banner, was supposed to be the banner of the revolution. Now it's really difficult to raise it because it's being used by the Free Syrian Army against Afrin. So it's really getting complicated. And this is, for me, the perfect example that really Syrians have failed in a very important point, because they have let everybody else to divide themselves in between. So everybody is hating each other, Arabs and Kurds, Alawites, Sunnis, what have you. I know that everybody would say, no, we are one people, واحد 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 الشعب السوري كثير حلو, very nice, talking with the National Coalition, SOC, saying that no, we have a Christian here, we have an Alawite here, and that's nice, we are all there, but nobody tackled this issue. And we are talking about 40, 50 years of dictatorship. Nobody was able to talk about religion. Nobody was able. So we are all living peacefully side by side, but you didn't even talk about religion with your neighbors. So you had all these feelings inside that never really were spoken up to. And the opposition used the same narrative like the regime in this sense. No, we don't have problems here. We all want people, And this all fired back, because by not addressing it, everybody else could use this. And this is what happened. Assad used it very virtually, because they do this from decades. Hafez the father already did this. And now everybody else is using this, And this is really, for me, the biggest problem now when you look at the future and how Syrians want to live together after all what happened to them, and they let themselves being manipulated in the sense to hate each other and fight each other, and the only happy person there is Bashar al-Assad staying in power, and everybody else taking a share of Syria. So not just blaming the others, we really, as the Syrians, I'm not a Syrian, but to really look, there's a big responsibility, and there's a lot of failure at the same time, yes. Sorry to go a little bit.
No, but just maybe it's worth to highlight that the tension between some fractions of the Free Syrian Army or rebel groups and the Pierret and the Kurdish troops is going back before Afrin. There's roots for this, but absolutely, I personally agree on your analysis on Afrin and what's going on. It's really, it's another moral failure and degradation.
Maybe just to come back to the question, I think that. Until the re-election of Erdogan next year, probably, there won't be any compromise by the Turkish government, because this war against Afrin is really very much driven by internal political issues, because he really needs this big enemy right now to push the people together, to get everybody at his side. So he really creates this PYD, YPG as the big terrorist enemy that he's fighting. While at the same time, with the hope to sending a lot of Syrians back, which means demographic change in the north of Syria as well, sending Arabs back, where you have an original Kurdish population as well. So this is probably very frustrating, because until Erdogan will be re-elected next year, there won't be any chance for compromise or a solution in the sense of the people living there, the people.
So Americans and Russians are okay with this, you see?
I think it depends. There might be maybe an American effort to say, okay, let's rename the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, let's find a new name, put some YPG here, or PYD, let's make it new, so acceptable somehow to face-saving, for the Turkish government. But I think the biggest interest for Turkey is really to keep this border region as a loyal space for the government. And when we look at really what they did to Afrin by now, and they already said that they will go until the Iraqi border. So I can only hope that the Americans will kind of not let their allies in the PYD down to an extent that they would just retreat and leave them up to Turkish military intervention. I think that's the betrayal of the Kurds that we have seen for many decades, that is repeating itself as well. Not meaning to highlight or to estimate the PYD and its ruling. It's not a democratic party, it's an authoritarian style party, that's for sure. But inviting Turkish troops to Syria just to finish off the Kurdish autonomy in the northeast is not the right way to deal with it, I think.
Thank you, Kristin. Thomas, back to your keynote. I'm curious to know, like, what do you think is the future of HTC, which is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is usually al-Nusra, previous to al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda affiliated group, not anymore officially, but still it is Al-Qaeda affiliated group. I mean, they denounced their relation to Al-Qaeda officially, but I mean, it's clear that they still have strong ties ideologically to Al-Qaeda. So what do you think that, because I'm asking also because you said it clearly, and really I was also interested in this point. You said it that the way HTC, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, sorry, I would say it in Arabic, is gaining ground or managed to gain ground is not because their ideology or not because they managed to attract locals. It's because of how well organized they are and the experience they have comparing to the other Syrian rebels, because this internal organization, it's been since Afghanistan, you know, they have traditions of having this, organizing themselves and emerging to be a dominant power in any chaotic situation. So, I mean, do you see them, like, there is any serious chance of defeat them by locals in Idlib province specifically, because it's their stronghold anytime soon, I mean.
Okay. Just perhaps, I mean, during the tour I had to simplify a bit. You know, another reason why they regularly defeat other rebels is also a matter of indoctrination. I mean, they teach their fighters that it's okay to kill other rebels, which the other groups don't. I mean, most of the time, in most groups, there is no indoctrination of any kind, anyway. They just don't teach anything to their fighters. They just, oh, revolution, fight the regime, it's fine. So the other rebels, most of the time, they don't think it's... I mean, they're Muslims, they're fighting the regime, how could we kill them? And on the other side, you have... I mean, in Tahrir al-Sham, you have these scholars who say, you know, kill each of them with a bullet in the hand, and you also kill the civilians with them. I mean, we know that for a fact. So this makes a huge difference. And so what we saw, especially in July, when there was this war between Tahrir al-Sham and Ahrar al-Sham, is that most units of Ahrar al-Sham, they actually didn't fight at all. They remained in their villages, and they made deals with Tahrir al-Sham, saying, okay, don't attack us, and we won't attack you. And so Tahrir al-Sham had like 1,000 guys who were moving across Idlib and defeating some units of Tahrir al-Sham in certain locations, like on the border in Idlib city, because they had these 1,000 people which would actually obey order and kill other rebels. Now, I mean, Tahrir al-Sham is really, I think, in a quite tricky situation now, because they're supposed to be the last standing man, okay, the last faction, you know, except for what remains of the Islamic State, that's fighting the regime. But at the same time, they're increasingly kind of sealed off from the regime, because, as you know, Turkey has been sending troops, I mean, building small military bases along the front line. And Turkey is supposed to act as a, you know, stabilizing force or a peacekeeping force. And there are also, you hear, I mean, more and more also communities in the greater Idlib, in northern Hama, you know, inviting the Turks to come in, okay, to protect them from the regime. So in the end, you know, that if that happens, that might make it totally impossible for Tahrir al-Sham to attack the regime. Which is annoying. Okay, if you're radical but you can't do anything radical, then you're in trouble. And then, you know, what can you do? You can attack the Turks, but, you know, for many reasons it's very problematic. On the other hand, you have this new al-Qaeda organization, which I think is called Hurras al-Din, which has been established because but you know, Tahrir al-Sham, you know, broke relations with Al-Qaeda, so the people who didn't want to break with Al-Qaeda created their own organization. And it's small, but they might also exploit the situation. You know, do with Tahrir al-Sham what Tahrir al-Sham has been doing with the other rebels. You know, saying, oh, you're the sellout. We will keep on fighting. which, you know, might be to a complete disaster, but might also be an opportunity to finally defeat these people in what would, you know, de facto become a Turkish protectorate, which is probably the future of these parts of Syria. And I mean, I don't think, perhaps I'm wrong, but I don't think that anytime soon Turkey will withdraw from either El-Bab or Azaz or even Afrin and allow the regime in. Because I think, I mean, the regime has too little manpower and it's too, do you say duplicitous? You mean they say something, they do something else? To rely on them to secure these regions against the PYD in the long term. I mean, at the first problem, they will allow the PYD to come back with regime uniform, which they did in the past, by the way. So around Manbij and so on. So I think Turkey is there for a very long time. And I was told today that by a Turkish friend that Turkey is actually already building new roads between Afrin and Turkey, because the road network is almost inexistent between. There is no border crossing to speak of between Afrin and so yeah.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Yassin, I have one simple direct question because also, yeah, I mean, you used genocide in your keynote, and you know how sensitive, complicated term is this, and I know you've been working on this in the past few months. So, can we call what's going on or what's happened in Syria as genocide, and why, and what, or if not, why not?
Actually, I myself developed some reservation to this concept because it is community-centered, because it supposes the concept of genocide that we have given communities identified by their pre-given identities, and they are targeted because they are from a racial, a national, an ethnic, or religious group according to UN Convention about Genocide in 1948. So I have some problems with that. But it has something in the, not in the legal literature, but in the sociological literature. It is a systematic killing, mass killing of people at the hands of a state, which destroys maybe not a community in itself, though the threshold of targeting Sunnis is low than the others, but it is related. I prefer, actually, in my work, I prefer the concept of politicide, killing people for political reasons, and which is also a continuation of killing them politically before without killing them physically. So I prefer this, but I think genocide has this very important characteristic. It is a meaningless, in a way, meaningless word for, or name for unnameable crime, which is killing huge numbers of people and destroying big communities. And this, the systematic thing about it is very important. We have a whole industry, a whole system of killing people under torture or by torture, massacres, siege, barrel bombs, and in jails. So a whole industry, and I think the concept of genocide is useful about this. Though, of course, we have to be a bit careful about it as being community-centered.
Thank you, Yassin. Now we will open up the floor to audience. If you have questions, please, but I would argue, please, to specify the speaker, or if you have maybe 2 questions, just to say who you are addressing question to, and to be short and precise as much as we can, please, because we have limited time and we need to have as many questions as possible. Yeah, please. Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Kristin. Please, also, it would be great if you introduce yourself so we know who you are.
Is this working?
Yes,
yeah.
We can hear you. Yes.
My name is Yasser Tabbara. I work with a Syrian civil society organization called the Syrian Forum. I'm an attorney by profession. So in an attempt to, I guess, do the impossible task that Thomas was trying to do, which is highlight some form of optimism or assume some sort of an optimistic role in all of this, especially at the 7th year anniversary. I think the focus, or taking the focus outside of the violent context and looking at what has been taking place in different localities in Syria over the past 7 years will lead us to see a number of, quasi-democratic experiments that have taken place over what have become to be formed as the local councils or the local governance bodies. Many bodies that spread over the entire areas that have originally or initially been liberated from the regime control. And I think there's something to be said there. If one is to highlight something optimistic about what's been taking place. I think that for the first time in over 5 decades, you had Syrians basically taking ownership of their own affairs, practicing true agency, and basically governing themselves. Obviously, notwithstanding the lifespan of that experiment, I think still is worthwhile to be highlighted at the height of these experiments. Obviously, these councils vary in terms of capacity, that they vary in terms of legitimacy, but one can argue that perhaps the only legitimate governance structure, no matter how small it is in comparison, still exists in Syria, but not in Damascus, but it exists in cities like Saleh, for example, which actually witnessed direct election to achieve its own local governance, and other cities in Idlib and other governance, actually. So that's one thing, or one comment that I wanted to make. The other comment, really quickly, I promise, and this is a reflection on what Yassin was talking about earlier, in terms of the active inaction, what you coined active inaction, which is essentially motivated by latent racism. And I would argue that it's not just at the governmental level or those at the decision-making echelon of Western democracies, but if you recall what the fig leaf that Obama hid behind when he refused to punish the Assad regime for crossing that red line on August 21st, when the chemical attack happened in Ghouta, was getting the approval of Congress, of U.S. Congress. And he also connected that somehow to the approval of the House of Commons in the UK. There was a vote that took place a couple of days before that, or a day before that, and failed. And the direct reason for that is the incredible amount of lobbying that took place from those on the left in Western societies. And I think the left, in a way, is directly complicit in terms of this inactive or active inaction, and in terms of this really, and the only way that one can really explain such an attitude by what one would consider more informed progressives is basically a racist attitude. If one is to reduce it to its basic component, it's really the inability to see the value of human life in those that do not look like you, that live in a different part of the world. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
So we might take another question before, if there's. Okay. Yeah, thank you for passing the mic, yes.
So, my question is...
Your name, please?
My name is Nicolas. I'm from Syria and involved in lots, just as volunteer in lots of organizations. My question is to Thomas and Kristin at the same time. To Thomas in the beginning is, do you think we need, in a way, to the locals in Greater Idlib to defeat al-Nusra HTIC, or is it a possible way, especially after the attitude they are doing after 2016, to get involved with them and somehow and change or try to be part of them and change the way they might be the last man in Syria or the last people who will be there? Is that, you think, from your studies and what you see, it's possible to do? And is it a good thing to happen somehow, because it might be the last stand if Bashar al-Assad gain Ghouta and then there is nothing around Damascus literally, and they are starting in Daraa already. And to Kristin, do you think something like that would be acceptable, or the governments from the outside or even the locals from Europe and the US will see that as a positive thing and they will support, or do they will never change the idea about how al-Nusra or the military group in Greater Idlib will rule there? Thank you.
So maybe we'll take answers from our guests and then we'll go for another wave of questions. So.
Yeah. So your first question about civilian council, I mean, you're totally right. I mean, I had only 10 minutes to speak of fairly complicated issues, so of course I agree with you. But at the same time, even if your focus is on like civilian, institutions like this, what I discuss, this ideological divide between, it's actually not between civilian and military opposition, but it runs across military factions. Okay, it's very important, because if all military factions had shared the jihadist vision of governance, I mean, no one of these civilian councils would still exist. They would have shut them down, all of them, like the Islamic State did. So I think it was the fact that the military factions were divided over how governance should happen, whether civilians should be part of it or not, was key to ensure the survival of these initiatives in the long term. And I'm not saying that FSA factions or mainstream factions in general have been very faithful defenders of civilian councils and whatever. They have certainly tried to influence them, manipulate them, repress them. But the key difference is that they did not formulate like a clear ideological vision that says these things should not exist at all, which is what the jihadis do. Okay, they say we have to do it, and there are very good reasons for which we have to take over justice, the services, everything. It should be in our hands. The FSA factions or Jabhat Shamiya, whatever, don't do that. So they at least that leaves a margin of maneuver for civilians. And the other question, sorry, was about whether how to deal with HTS. Is it should you defeat them or try to make them evolve? I mean, I've always been very skeptical about their ability to really undergo like a significant ideological change. Similar to what extent, for instance, I think their big rival, Ahrar al-Sham, they've gone much farther in the way of, ideological transformation. I think in a more, sorry to use the word, but in a more sincere way than HTS, which is very, in my view, cynical and pragmatic. Probably the answer lies between the two, so between defeating them and allowing them to change, which, as I understand, has actually been the Turkish strategy in a way. It seems that the strategy of Turkey to deal with them has been at the same time to carry out some fairly aggressive covert operations against them, ranging from leaking conversations which were quite indicting conversations between HTS commanders, to perhaps some people say even assassinations, I don't know. And at the same time, you know, dealing with them in a way that forces them to adjust and become more pragmatic. Yeah, I don't know.
Thank you for your comments and questions. Personally, concerning Idlib, I am very pessimistic. I mean, already for, I think, half a year, Western countries are discussing if they could still send humanitarian aid or things like that to Idlib province, because they are afraid that it would be, you know, manipulated or it would end up with HTS, which is, from a Western point of view, in the end, Al-Qaeda. You know, whoever has the name of al-Nusra or any connection to al-Nusra that leads back to Al-Qaeda is, from a Western point of view, it has this label, terrorist. So I don't see any possibility for a Western country now to support military groups in Idlib, because it's very complicated, and, you know, now sending money to the other factions that are right now fighting each other, this is all too little too late. I think Idlib is really a case of we can wait and see. It's a question of months, maybe a year, that Bashar al-Assad will bomb it in ruins, and you know, the same as we saw in Homs in eastern Aleppo and now see in eastern Ghouta. So I'm not very optimistic about Idlib. If there is any place inside Syria that the West should consider to protect or to somehow engage even militarily, would be the south, Daraa, you know, where you have at least the southern front, which was somehow a unification of different rebel groups, supposedly more moderate than somewhere else. You know, it didn't really work out. We see now that the regime is starting its attacks there. So I'm very skeptical, and I think, I mean, the US has officially ended its military aid in 2017, and so I think from a Western point of view, it's all already, we are already having other discussions. It's about, should we rebuild Syria with Bashar al-Assad? I mean, this is what people are discussing now, and we have several European countries and the US will have a clear stance here and say, no, no, we will not rebuild Syria as long as this regime is governing Syria. But of course, yes, we have to have some direct, you know, we have to rebuild electricity here and there, you know, help some hospitals here and there. Humanitarian aid, obviously, humanitarian aid is completely politicized in Syria. You know, if the UN, the United Nations, cannot manage to reach the most vulnerable and the people that are most in need inside Syria for years on a humanitarian level, you know, how could you ever think about rebuilding a country with, I mean, the worst would be a Marshall Plan, you know, throwing all this country inside, all this money into the country and to the regime, because every euro that we send to Damascus, you know, with the aim of rebuilding some kind of whatever, water pipes, will end up with the regime, and it will, you know, keep on or keeping the very structures in power that make peace impossible in any future of Syria. So this is really where we have to focus on from a Western point of view, you know, to make sure that governments in the West don't slowly, you know, have this discourse about, you know, we should somehow, you know, we have to talk to them. We have on the AfD delegation now, politicians from the right-wing German AfD traveling there. We have, Switzerland has already opened up an office there. You know, we have several non-governmental organizations, which is really puzzling from my point of view. Non-governmental organizations who consider how to engage now in Syria out of a misunderstanding or not knowing very well what's going on. And this is really, this comes without a need to do so, because, I mean, people are really being taken care of in governmental areas by the UN, all the food and the shelter, although it goes there. So there is no need really to go there as a NGO, international NGO, to open up an office just to say, you know, we are taking care of Syria. Because this is very counterproductive, because this sends the signal of rehabilitating the Assad regime, and it is being used by the regime to this end. We just saw this, what happened. So this is my answer to this, and I just want to make it a little bit more positive as well. I completely agree with my colleague there, the attorney, who said that, you know, civil society has woken up. You know, 50 years of dictatorship, but it has woken up, and it will not go back to sleep. You know, it's struggling inside the country. Civil society is even struggling outside the country among each other's different groups, different activists, but it is there, and there are these experiences that are very fruitful, I think, and very strong for every person who has involved or engaged in these local councils. There were 700 local councils back in 2015, 8 elected provincial councils. Many people in Germany don't know about all this because they were being active there and then very much too little, too late again, you know, being funded and helped, and they could never really gain this position that they deserve because they were not receiving the money that they should have. So by now I think it's 300 local councils, so it's getting lesser, but the people who did this, the people who have these experiences, they will not, probably they will not accept to live under any form of authoritarian rule, be it by jihadis, be it by Islamists, be it by the Assad regime. So they will, hopefully, these are the people that I talked about, will probably shape a democratic future of Syria someday. This will take a while, but they are there.
To just the question of Osama, I think I tend to think of racism as something related more to class than to culture. It is related to capitalism and especially to the neoliberal capitalism that came after the end of the Cold War, and we've been witnessing the rise of identity politics since 1990s and even more in the last in the 2 decades that have passed from this century. So it is not a matter of ideology, it is not a matter of Western culture, it is a matter of this. It is a tool of governance. It is related to capitalism, in my opinion. And this rise of, as for the leftists in the West, this is a big disappointment for me, and I don't find an explanation. It is not, maybe there's a part of Islamophobia in it, but it is, their vision of the world is very old. They are still in that old war that was lost of the days of Cold War, and I don't find anything interesting or new in their vision of the analysis of the world. So it is part of their the crisis of the left, of the global left. But the main thing about racism is, I think, the rise of identity politics related to neoliberal policies. And that's what this structural thing is hurting the people in the West, and they cannot stop it because of the crisis. We don't have working class. There's a lot of changes on the formation of working class and the industrialization and all these issues. And now the social movements are fragmented here or there. They defend feminists here, environmental issues here, solidarity groups who are specialized in expressing their solidarity with this specific cause or that. And also there's this hierarchy of victims. These are our victims, those are not. For instance, in relation to Syria, those who are mostly supportive to the Kurdish issue are mostly, I'm sorry to say, against the Syrian cause, and vice versa in a way. So yeah, we are in this nasty situation, and hopefully Syria will change. The crisis that's happening in the world will trigger different ways of thinking and maybe of acting in the coming future. I hope there will be some potential of change in relation to this deepening global crisis.
So we have like time for a couple of more questions. No, you need just to pick a mic, please. And I think there is one in the room. Yes.
Yeah. My name is Inanna Othman. I'm a PhD student at the ZMO, working on Syria. We are here in the Volksbuhne, like it's the Red Salon, so maybe it's not the wrong place to ask this question. We have made the experience here in Germany, talking about Germany, meeting leftist group initiatives, organizing events and panels about Syria, on the war against Syria, about the beautiful Syria before the war, before the revolution, and proving their failure to reflect their own ideology and reflect their own language, like protecting Assad regime even stronger and more radical than Shabiha, than the pro-Assad militia in Syria, which is like always very disappointed experience for us. My question to you, Yassin, how would you see that, or how would you judge that as a leftist Syrian intellectual?
I've just said that it is extremely shocking to me, actually. I think there's something imperialist in their formation. They annex our struggle to a grand struggle we are all supposed to be involved in, the struggle against imperialism. And I don't see that they are doing anything, actually, against imperialism or against anybody. So this is what I find shocking. They want to put us under their arms while they are doing nothing. They are supporting juntas like the Assad regime and the others. And in a way, there's nothing interesting in the in theory, on the level of theory and the leftist circles. So it is up to us, I think, especially your generation, to maybe to come up with new and interesting ideas about the present world. The important point, I think, related to Syria is that we cannot, from now on, or at least in the last 7 years, we cannot confine ourselves in analyzing or understanding the Syrian situation to Syria. Syria is a global metaphor, as I tried to say, and it is about the world now. So, and we are now here. You are here, so many of us, and we can maybe build networks with activists, with intellectuals, with academicians to analyze, to understand better, and to act together to deal with this global crisis. This is the hopefully revolutionary potential in this horrible situation in our country, which is affecting all the world.
If I may add a little point here, because about the left, because it's very important actually. I think that the main problem with the Syrian war is as well that not only leftist people, but as well some experts or journalists or colleagues tend to look at the war from a mainly geopolitical perspective. So they have this big, they look at the ground, they say, this is the West trying to do another regime change, it's the same story, we saw this in Iraq, we saw this, and then they take whatever fits in their theory without looking at the details on the ground. And this is big hypocrisy, because all these leftist people who always, stand up for the rights of other people somewhere else and revolutions here and there, they are really starting to patronize the Syrians, by telling them, it's all the CIA. Without the CIA, you wouldn't even go to the streets, It's like whatever happened in 2011 was an installation by the CIA, who sent their weapons and money and what have you, and not realizing that they could just open the internet and look at all the huge demonstrations in Hama and Deir ez-Zor in June with 500,000 people demonstrating peacefully. Then you have some activists who say, this was the regime flag, it was all pro-Assad rallies. Really, I've read this, There's a guy, this guy who's sitting there in Latakia, I think, this German, And he was told that, you know, that was all pro-Assad rallies because it was still the Syrian flag and the regime flag by now, back in 2011, so they were all pro-Assad. Not knowing that they were chanting, you know, Hurriya, Hurriya, ma ahla al-Hurriya, or I don't know. So this is a big problem. So you have serious experts and analysts like Michael Lüders or like different guys like Daniele Ganza, you know, who keep on explaining to the people here that the West, it's again the West who started a war, and, you know, and these people, these leftist people, they take it up very easily like this because this is what they want to hear. Because as Yassin said, they are still caught in this old ideology. You know, West is bad and Russia is good, and so whoever intervenes for Western goals, it's bad, and whatever Russia does is somehow, you know, useful. So this is a problem as well. I think the geopolitical level of analyzing the Syrian conflict, and it would really have to look on the ground. This is what I meant by saying, you know, as long as we don't take the perceptions of the Syrians on the ground into consideration, we don't understand the conflict in the first place.
I would just add one point. It is not about us, however. I think they are against Obama or against Trump, against Macron, against I don't know whom in the West, and they don't know anything about Syria. In a way, they think that we are, the Assad is against imperialism. They remember something about this 30 or 40 years ago, and that's it. That's it. Even people like Chomsky. I haven't read a bit of interesting analysis or idea or information in his work. So it is not about us. It is about their own struggles. And I said that they are imperialists because they want to annex our struggle too. They don't recognize any degree of autonomy of our struggle from the struggles that they don't do. In addition to that, they are not really involved in the struggles against imperialism that they want to impose on us.
So you have a comment on the left?
Yeah, I actually have something to say. Okay. Yeah, in my former university, a year ago, I discovered that two full professors who had nothing to do with Syria in terms of expertise, not even with the Arab world or the Middle East or anything related to it at all. And one of them not even with politics or human beings, were actually regularly publishing pieces of, you know, conspiracy theories about the Ghouta massacre. That it was one of them actually right. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, incredible that, you know, the victims were killed by the rebels in gas chambers, and then the whole thing was staged, you know, for world consumption. I mean, this is the level of nonsense, and of course, you know, white helmets, they're Al Qaeda and CIA, of course, at the same time, as we all know. You know, this whole nonsense by, you know, senior academics in the prestigious British universities, it's really scary. Like, they publish this kind of rubbish every day. And what's really worrying, and sorry for my, you know, the technophobic rant, but I see a parallel with what happened in the 90s with the war in Bosnia, where, you know, the left, I mean, it was in a way, it was a kind of rehearsal for Syria, if you look at it in retrospect. You know, much of the left had already the stance that, you know, NATO is with the Bosnian Muslims, so they must be bad people. And they're in kind of fascists, they're Islamists. I mean, the Islamophobia was already there. Actually, you will find that some of Bush's arguments were already used by the left at that time. And also, you know, this convergence, this red-brown convergence between, you know, the hard left and, you know, Serbian supremacists. That was, you know, hardline, the right wing in Europe. That was already there. But these crazy conspiracy theories, you know, or like Srebrenica massacre never happened. To have access to them, you had to read some, but in the 90s, you know, before the internet, at least in Europe, you had to go for fairly obscure publications, you know, precisely by some dodgy, you know, Serbian supremacist publishing house in Switzerland. It was very hard to find. I mean, I read some of them at the time out of curiosity, but you would have to go to the library and dig and to find them. You wouldn't find them in your bookshop. And the problem is today it's available to absolutely everyone. That's the scary thing. Not only to read it, but to publish your own rubbish if you feel that overnight you've become a Syria expert and a public intellectual. So, yeah, I mean, that's it.
Just interesting. I will just quickly. I mean, this like Kristin started and Thomas also built on that. The number of experts in Syria, especially among the left, who lectured us about Syria. Really, I mean, I'm speaking from personal experience, and who never been in Syria, not just as a visitor, never lived there, of course, and they don't speak Arabic, which I find also horrible. You know, or so it's something we've been suffering from. Through debates and many confrontations. So we still have time for 1 or 2 questions maximum. Yes, I see 2, 3 hands. Yeah.
Hi.
But then if we can be short and precise, then we can give really a chance to others to ask. Please.
Hi, my name is Shami. I'm a journalist. My question is to Mohammad. I just would like to know, I just would like to know that why did you call it revelation? Why did you call it revolution?
Revolution.
Revolution, yeah.
Can we have other questions so we can make the best of the time?
Hello, my name is Pierret Madhoun. I'm a poet. Yassin, what if we were the bad group? Like what we think about us as a left people. We see Chavez as a great man, Castro as a great man, Putin. Some of my left friends, they have a photo of Stalin at their homes. We killed most of the people in the last century. At least 80 million people got killed by the left. What if it's not by mistake, this support for Assad from the left? What if we were really criminal and we didn't notice that?
Sorry, can we take the final question? Because I saw another hand. If there is still, and then
my name is Azzam, and my question to Yassin as well. So, Yassin, is there any good example of the world political community that intervene in favor of in favor of the people? I mean, is there any good example? I mean, is the world political community has really did something? I mean, before the Syrian Revolution?
Yeah, I think they did something. Can I answer?
Yeah, of course. I think
it was good in former Yugoslavia. They stopped the genocide there. Now, in history, we don't have guarantees that everything will be great after intervention. And if, let's suppose, they punished the Assad regime in 2013, the regime fall down. Of course, Syria will not be great after half a century of harsh dictatorship. Things will go on for 15, 20 years of difficulty. But yes, I think there's now, in 2005, this concept of responsibility to protect. And after the genocide in Rwanda and in Yugoslavia, many good-intentioned people thought that there should be some international mechanism to protect people against so-called sovereign states that are massacring them. The problem is that still there are we have a concept for it, responsibility to protect, but we don't have really independent and respectable mechanism to effect this responsibility. There's a deep contradiction in the world today between the oligarchy of the Security Council and what's happening in the world. The world is changing, the system, the international system is rigid. So again, hopefully the crisis will change it without big war. Our history in the 20th century was that the international system changed only after huge wars. The League of Nations after the First World War and this one. We hope, one can only hope that it will be changed without big war. Riyadh, I don't think that we are criminals. I think we yeah, of course. It is not inherent in being a leftist to be a criminal. Maybe there are static, the leftist thinking of the 20th century invested a lot in the concept of state. And they found themselves supportive of states like the fascists, by the way. This is a common ground between the ultra-wing fascists and the Stalinists. I say Stalinists because I think some of us are good-intentioned people, and they were they not only good intention, they were good politicians, good activists, good militants in South America, for instance, and in the national liberation movements. They didn't kill people systematically the way we are seeing in Syria or in Cambodia or Stalinist Russia. Can I just answer the question about why do you call it revolution instead of Muhammad? Take it from me.
Be my guest. I mean.
Because it was a popular thing. Because we did it. Because we've been ruled by one of the harshest dictatorships in the world, and we just want to change. And because it was peaceful, because it was have very broad social basis at the beginning, then because of extremely violent reaction from the regime, the Syrian Revolution was radicalized. People became more violent, became sectarianized in a way, because also we've been ruled by a sectarian regime for almost 2 generations. So it was a revolution. Then it is now a mixture of revolution, of civil war, of war by proxy, of regional war, and of genocide. But the Syrians rebelled against a brutal regime, and they wanted freedom. They wanted more justice and more freedom. It is not just because we are defeated and our country in this messy situation that it was not a revolution.
Thank you, Yassin. I mean, you said what I would have said. Thank you very much. We are coming to the end of the first session. We will have now half an hour pause or break, and then we'll resume at 7:30 with other guest speakers. So if you want to join us later, you are more than welcome. Thank you very much, and thank you for Yassin, Kristin, and Thomas.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're still waiting for the rest who didn't take their seats yet.
They will remain in their seats. All of them prefer to stay where they are. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining our second panel in our evening, 7 years after the revolution, what's next for Syria? To go through other 3 of the most discussed and important aspects of the Syrian issue, negotiations, terrorism and jihadist movements, and legal endeavors to account the Syrian regime, I am honored to welcome my guest speakers tonight. Professor Bassma Kodmani, the Executive Director of the Arab Reform Initiative and Associate Professor in International Relations at Paris University. She served as Senior Advisor at the French National Research Council, since Senior Research Fellow at CERI, Sciences Po, Advisor to the Académie Diplomatique International, and Senior Visiting Fellow at the Collège de France. Sorry, I don't speak French at all, so it's really tough to pronounce. From 1981 to 1998, she established and directed the Middle East program at the Institute Francis de Relations Internationals, IFRI. In Paris, she holds a PhD in political science from Sciences Po in Paris. She has authored and edited books, reports, and articles on conflicts, political and security reforms, and religious authorities in the Middle East. Kodmani holds the distinction of Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur of France. Welcome, Dr. Bassma. I want also to welcome Nicolas Hénin, holds a Master in History of International Relations from Paris 1 Pantheon Sorbonne University, and a Master's degree in Journalism from the Practical Institute for Journalism, also Paris. He spent most of his life as freelance reporter based first in Baghdad between 2002-2004, then Amman 2004-2007. He then enlarged his perimeter to Africa and covered all of the MENA region, mostly for Le Point, news magazine, and Arte Channel. He covered intensively the Arab Spring revolutions and went numerous times to Syria. He's been abducted by ISIS in Raqqa, Syria, and kept hostage for almost a year. He's the author of several essays, including Jihad Academy. And my last dear guest speaker for tonight is Mazen Darwish. Mazen is a Syrian human rights defender and journalist. He obtained his law degree from Damascus University. He's currently the president of the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression, SCM, which he established in Damascus in 2004 with his activist colleagues. In 2011, Mazen established the Violations Documentation Center, VDC, with his friends, the activists Razan Zaytouni, Wael Hamada, and Nazim Hamadi, in order to pursue the violations of the Syrian regime against demonstrators and peaceful protesters. Since the beginning of the activism, of his activism, Mazen Darwish has been subjected to numerous arrests and harassment by the Assad regime. His last arrest came in the February 16, 2012, where he spent 3.5 years of detention. During his detention in 2015, Mazen won the UNESCO World Press Freedom Prize and shared the Pinter Prize for the year 2014 with the writer Salman Rushdie. Welcome, thank you for being with us. I start with you, Nicolas. So,
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be here. I'm extremely honored to share the stage with remarkable persons. My intervention will be much more of a testimony, and I would like to bring here a few facts about two conflicts that I know well, for having covered them both as a journalist. I would also like to shed some light on some fantasies and conspiracy exploitation that these two conflicts have produced, and I'm talking of the invasion of Iraq and the war in Syria. I call it a war, it doesn't mean it's not a revolution. You may ask why I'm connecting these two wars that are apparently so different. Well, because they still have a lot in common. One must recall the war in Iraq was based on a lie. The moral cost of this lie was considerable. Not only did it have an impact a criminal impact for the Iraqis, who saw that their country destroyed, but it also ruined the credit of the West. And it even offered the best possible arguments to the opponents of democracy to discredit the West. It is not coincidence that the few times we have seen in the West, consideration about engaging by force in order to solve the crisis in Syria. Well, pro-Assad propagandists posted in mass the infamous photo showing Colin Powell brandishing, his flask at the stage of the UN Security Council, just like to say, see, they are liars by nature. By lying, that time, the US and the West has offered a golden opportunity to tyrants and liars around the world to pretend that we, and not them, are the liars. I must, at this stage, make an important point. The West is not a uniform social or political object. Several countries, including France, my country, and Germany, where I am now, have refused this war. And even in the US or in the UK, which led the invasion, we have seen huge movements to oppose this invasion. And another important point, to defend that this war was illegal, the invasion of Iraq was illegal and even criminal, does not give any credit to Saddam Hussein, who was a brutal and untenable dictator. The Kremlin propaganda and its supporter represents the world as divided between two kinds of countries. On one side, an imperialistic West, and on the other, benevolent countries respectful of sovereignty and international legality. This is, of course, wrong. It was Moscow, for instance, that opened the doors of global jihad by invading Afghanistan in 1979. And it was the Russian army that intervened in Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria. In my opinion, it is a mistake to oppose the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the Russian intervention in Syria. On the contrary, these are two symmetrical interventions. Just like Saddam and Bashar are not opposite, they just mirror one the other. In both cases, the intervening country has used a form of legitimacy, that is the so-called defense of human rights in the first case, for the American invasion of Iraq, and a request by a disputed regime in the second case. And so this use of a form of legitimacy was done to support a community involved in a domestic political conflict contaminated by sectarianism. In Iraq, the Shia majority kept out of power by a Sunni minority regime provided the opportunity for the US to step in, and in Syria, the Shia minority, monopolizing power in an authoritarian manner against a Sunni majority, has called for help in order to safeguard. I must here open a parenthesis in order to be accurate. The minority holding power in Syria is Alawite. Alawites have been considered as Shia only since the French Mandate. But since the beginning of the revolution, Iran phagocytized them. In return, many Alawites developed their Shia identity. A sign of that are the ceremonies like Ashura or Arba'in, quite unknown in Syria until pro-regime Alawites decided to thank Iran for its support by developing their Shiite identity. But to come back to my comparison, in both cases, the intervention into local, mainly political crisis served imperial aims. And in both cases, the fight against terrorism has been used as a pretext, which is very serious. Terrorism is one of the most severe threats to the cohesion of our societies. To instrumentalize counterterrorism with a political objective leads to fuel conspiracy theories. It strengthens the cohesion of our societies. It therefore indirectly helps terrorism. This is exactly what Bashar al-Assad regime did to corrupt the revolution that threatened to overthrow it. Like probably many of you, I was in Syria at the very beginning of the revolution. I could see how it looked like in its early days. Joyful, peaceful, above sects and communities. It is important today to keep this in mind. For the regime, to push for the radicalization of the revolution was the only way to survive. It has been clearly documented how it has favored the most extremist and for long focused its attacks only on the moderates. By massacring civilians, terrorizing with bombardments, imprisonment, rape, torture, all this was aimed at radicalizing the Syrians. It is of prime importance to recall the chronological order and the responsibility of the regime, but it should not lead us to denial. There is today in Syria an immense terrorist challenge, which concerns all the areas held by the opposition and radiates the whole region and even the whole world. Finally, I would like to remind you of what happened in my country 2 centuries ago during the French Revolution. On July 14, 1789, the revolution broke out when the people of Paris took the Bastille, or the large and symbolic political dungeon in Paris that everyone hated. But 3 years later, the revolutionaries who took over power inaugurated the reign of terror. For 2 years, the revolution consumed its own children, killing even many of its partisans. To purge, the revolutionaries considered as too moderate. Yet, it would be stupid to exploit this terrible chapter in the history of France to disqualify the revolution. It took almost a century, with some episodes of counter-revolution, new revolutions, foreign wars, and even an empire, before France eventually found a stabilized political regime generally respecting the rule of law. You can take this reminder as despairing, but I see it rather reassuring and an invitation to be patient. A revolutionary process is always long, painful, and even bloody. It can experience phases of acceleration, but also setbacks. And terror is a revolutionary process. And terror, in a revolutionary process is not a historical anomaly. It often accompanies such a political upheaval. This does not mean that the revolution is disqualified or that ultimately a stable and just political regime cannot be found. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for these strong opinions, and we look forward to hear the questions about it when we finish. Bassma, I move to you.
Thank you, and thank you for this kind invitation and the lovely company of excellent speakers before and now on this stage. I have been asked to speak about the negotiation process, and it is probably the most frustrating subject that I have to address. But given that I am also a member of the negotiating team that comes and goes to Geneva with no results, I should report back to this audience what I think cannot be achieved, has not been achieved, that you know, and if there is anything that can be achieved in Geneva. I would start by building on what Yassin Haj Saleh said. I have not formulated it in the same radical terms he has used, although I tend to approve the need for radical formulation of the Syrian reality. What I would like to say is that building on this sad reality, which is that the whole world looks at Syria, witnesses crimes, and comes out saying, this is unacceptable. And for Syrians, the word unacceptable has become completely hollow. It does not mean anything because no action is taken, as you know, neither on the unacceptability of what the Syrian regime of Assad is doing or on Russia's direct complicity. So I think that we need to integrate this sad reality. I have ceased to want to expose the Syrian tragedy and the suffering of people because the feeling is you do not get the response that you expect, that you hope will be triggered by what people are seeing. So out of pride, maybe, I think we Syrians have to live with this reality. Our country does not represent in the eyes of the world, or I would say there is an approach that looks at Syria as not central strategically, whereas Syria over the last 7 years has proved to be absolutely central in so many ways. So I think the argument of human suffering has not worked, and until now is just not working to trigger any decent response. The argument about security, that Syria is in the backyard of Europe, even a few weeks before 1 million Syrians arrived in Europe, there was still an American discourse from the Obama administration saying, we have successfully contained the Syrian crisis, it will not spill over. And the Europeans were repeating the same. The Syrian crisis has been contained. A few weeks later, 1 million refugees arrive in Europe. Even that has not become a trigger for a serious policy to respond to the Syrian crisis and the risks it represents. So we have also failed in triggering a response related to the security consequences of Syria. Now, I think that over the last, it's been now 2.5 years, 2 and something years, where we have been asked as the opposition to form a united, cohesive political coalition in order to negotiate with the regime. I think what we are living is again the same hypocrisy of those same countries that took no action in face of the succession of catastrophes that we have seen over the years, now pretend to believe that the answer is in a negotiation process in Geneva. And Geneva has been designated as the place for diplomatic discussions, a UN special envoy with a big team of advisors to facilitate negotiations between the regime and the opposition. But if you think of Geneva as a process between two parties who are discussing and agreeing to mutual concessions, which is what negotiations should be, then these talks are simply non-existent. So why do we still go to Geneva? First of all, because it is the place where the opposition has a voice. And however horrible what you hear during those sessions when we are in Geneva, at least we get a chance of having media attention, international attention, diplomatic attention. To what kind of result? Zero result. I would concede to that. It does keep Syria on the international agenda, yes, to some extent. It forces countries to pretend that Syria is important and that they are looking for a solution to Syria. Certainly, it is the place where the international players are forced to deal with the opposition on an equal footing with the regime, despite the unfavorable balance of forces on the ground, the military forces. And even if this is only formal parity with the regime, it forces the regime and its allies to accept the opposition as a legitimate partner in a negotiation. All of this is symbolic. The regime is disturbed even by the symbolism of an opposition that has a legitimate place in an international, in the international arena and in negotiations. But and that is why it has refused so far to engage in any direct negotiation. And finally, it is the place where we can imagine or hope to corner the regime and prove that it is not committed to a peaceful political process. Now, these are all token benefits that have not had the slightest impact on the conflict. The reality of the Geneva process so far has been that deals are struck on the ground between the regime and local groups after exhaustion of the civilian population, or in other places, such as Astana, where the UN ends up waiting for the results of Astana in order to pretend it is going to build on those when it comes back to Geneva. I think the latest tragedy of the Eastern Ghouta is a very interesting indication that none of what has happened in Geneva has made the slightest difference in the calculus of Russia, certainly the regime, but we have no hope that the regime will ever concede anything. But the revelation here is that Russia has in fact, over the last 2 and something years, pretended it was interested in a political solution, and in fact was preparing and backing the preparation of a major operation on the Ghouta. And I think where that leaves us is that we have to think very in a lucid and realistic way and in a non-emotional way about the new stage in which we are in this conflict. I call it conflict today because there are conflicting parties, fighting parties, but we all know what it is. It is the struggle of a people against a dictatorship. The military confrontation is definitely not over, but the rationale of the logic or the dynamics of the military confrontation is not fed as it was over the last few years. And I think we are coming to a point where the civilian population is again the major player and should be seen as the major player and should be encouraged as the major player in this conflict, because two things are proving right. One is that when the population demonstrated peacefully and came out against the regime, international sympathy, but also inside sympathy, more importantly, from the Syrian population was considerable. So it was really the pattern of a population, a society mobilizing against a dictator. the second strength that we see among civilians as opposed to armed groups is the current effort by the civilian population, particularly in the north of Syria, where demonstrations against al-Nusra is succeeding in expelling al-Nusra from different areas, one after the other. Now, this phenomenon is, I think, because it does not seek to measure the military power of armed groups against al-Nusra, is precisely what disarms al-Nusra. And so, vis-à-vis the regime or vis-à-vis these groups, civilians are proving to be the most effective player in upholding demands, in proving that radical extremist terrorist groups have no place and no support inside Syrian society. And of course, I think if this voice is really strengthened from those who can still play a role in organizing locally and nationally the civilian population to have a voice, that this is the one and only force which will prove that Assad cannot rule again. It is by giving up arms, I think, at this stage, that we will prove that Assad cannot govern. So I really believe we are at a turning point, and that we need to build on this reality. Of course the armed groups will resist. Of course they wouldn't like what I'm saying, but they themselves have reached a point where, as was described earlier, they are instrumentalized to serve other agendas than a Syrian agenda. They are engaged in fights that are simply not Syrian fights, and more importantly, they are mobilized to fight, as Syrians, to fight other Syrians. And this is a tragedy. This is another form of the Syrian tragedy. So I think we have really reached the limit of what armed struggle or the militarization of the struggle has led to. And it is too early to say this was a failure, in the sense that armed groups should never have been armed or carry arms. I don't think this is true, and we don't have time to analyze that and to assess exactly. But certainly the way things have gone with the militarization of the struggle has gone to the last, to the end of what that logic can produce. And it has produced a dead end for the Syrian people. And with that, if we acknowledge that this has happened, then I think we can move to something new. In terms of negotiations, I believe that there is one way we can make this process, or this political process, produce something and serve a certain purpose. And that is to say that instead of trying desperately to convince the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, to engage in bilateral negotiations, the UN can, if it is supported by countries that believe in the need for a political transition, can work with the one party that is willing to engage, and that is the opposition. But the opposition broadened to represent more the civilian population, to represent more broadly all the areas of Syria, and particularly those civil institutions that have developed over the years in the areas where the regime has withdrawn. So I think there is one path, and we have advocated this with the UN. It will continue to be a sterile process if you seek some involvement of the regime in these discussions. The one track that can be followed is that the preparation of Syria and Syrian society to develop the actual alternative to Assad's rule, even if it is on paper at this stage, is to look at what a security framework would look like, what reconciliation between communities might be, what kind of social contract and commitment the different communities can make vis-à-vis each other, because we are rebuilding a society on different terms, and therefore we need this dialogue to take place. The fact is that Syrians want to have this dialogue, try to have this dialogue, and no party whatsoever helps in this regard. And I think this is where today there is, again, a responsibility for the international community. That this process is something that Syrians really want, would like to see, and cannot achieve on their own. It is possible to build an entire, a comprehensive, alternative system with the rule of law, the way the judiciary would function, the way a constitution could be drafted and approved, the way, as I said, a social contract can be crafted, and the way a reconstruction, I would say security as a major starting point would be essential. And with this rationale, if the opposition broadens its dialogue or broadens its platform to include beyond what we call today the Moscow platform, even if these people do represent something that Russia wants, and they are not a comfortable partner, yet they do reach out to a different constituency inside Syria. It is more important to talk to these kinds of Syrians than to wait for the regime to make any concessions. Where we need a switch in the attitude of the international community is to really center on what Syrian society, starting from the opposition and expanding into those gray areas where the people, out of fear, out of hesitation, out of the fear of the unknown, are not engaging. This is something where there is no support that has come because of this sterile attempt to keep two parties negotiating and talking to each other. The narrative about Syria is what we need to correct. The Syrian regime has committed what I would call not a crime against humanity only, but maybe a concept that should be developed around a crime against society. And a crime against society is when a regime has tried to tear apart the social fabric. And this is what the Syrian regime has done. So it can commit crimes against individuals, which are the most horrible that we have seen, but it is also committing a crime that, over the long term, keeps a population from restoring its cohesiveness and its ability and its fabric, basically. I think this concept of a crime against society, and therefore how one rescues a society from the control of this criminal regime, is what the international players who count need to integrate in order to help the Syrian people reach out among themselves. And on this, the Syrians, I think, have enough will to do it, but I don't think they can achieve it on their own if they are not heard. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Bassma, for being very clear and honest regarding the negotiation process and also the situation of Syria and the position of the opposition in it. We listen to you, Mazen, and then we open the discussion.
Thank you, Yasmine, and thank you, Nicolas and Bassma, and all of you. It's really an honor to be here with you today. And I will try to continue in the same line where Bassma talking. Especially, I just came from a meeting with the United Nations regarding al-Ghouta, and really it seems, yes, the suffering of the civilian, it's not a manner or something important anymore now. In the negotiation in Geneva, as Bassma honest to explain, it seemed like nobody really feel that this kind of negotiation will bring any peace or any resolution. And the serious negotiation happened in maybe Astana or between the regional country in general and the international power. The problem that those regional power and the Lord of War who's in this real negotiation don't care about peace, sustainable peace in Syria, about all these crime against individual or the society, and they are not trying to build a kind of country that Syrian can be able to alive in it. It's only about the regional interest and about sharing power and interest between the Lord of the Lord. For us as a Syrian, as a civilian who's not part from this military war and still believe in our right to live in ordinary situation like all people, it seems for us very important problem to have this kind of agreement, political agreement, without sustainable peace, because this is mean that we prepare the country for a new war. This new war, it will be destroyed any possibility to have social reconciliation in Syria. This war will be built in revenge, because any political agreement between any party ignore what happened, all these crime against humanity and war crime, cannot be able to achieve any sustainable peace. The Russians, who now are involved in this kind of a crime, so they are also protect themselves, not only the regime. They not allow to find any kind of legal solution for this crime through ICC or Security Council. But still, it's justice, not a revenge. It's about to protect our society and our future from revenge, from new war. While the Russians prefer Grozny style, this kind of solution in general. As Yassin always said, Syria is not the war in Syria or the revolution in Syria. It's not a Syrian anymore. Peace in Syria also is not a Syrian matter. Without sustainable peace in Syria, there is no way to have peace in any place. We can't defeat ISIS or al-Nusra or any kind of jihadist organization if we not succeed to achieve sustainable peace, build in accountability and justice in Syria. The youth who lose their belief in human rights and democratic value will go directly to violence and to extremism. We tried before now more than 20 years since Iraq and Afghanistan to defeat extremism by military act without achieve any succeed. I'm afraid now also in Syria, we copy the bad solution in Iraq, just bombing the military power, Al-Qaeda, like in Iraq now ISIS and al-Nusra, killed the leader like al-Zarqawi without any political transition, without any justice, without solve the reason which push people for violence, just have this easy victory. Then after a few time, we have ISIS. And now in Syria, copy the same problem, same way, and create maybe later Haishish, Naishish, Laishish, any new version of this kind of organization. And this is not only the Syrian responsibility, this is the responsibility of all of us and all the international community. Justice in Syria also very important for us as a refugee now. If any government in Europe or anybody think or believe that those refugees who are suffering from the regime and see their lover, their picture, through, by example, Caesar photo, dying in this ugly way from torture, anyone believe that they be able to go back to Syria by themselves and voluntarily, if the same regime and the same security services and the same war crime, the people who made this war crime still in the power? Me, myself, to be honest with you, I will never go back. And I don't think any one of the refugees will be able to go back in this situation. Justice also in Syria, it's not for the Syrian only. Especially we are here in Berlin, in this city, which I learned from it that without justice you can't go forward for a future. You can't build a sustainable society or a good lifestyle in general. There is many ways to send to the Syrian, to the youth, to the humanity in general, a positive message, even in this very bad situation in general. Just let us tell them that believe in the value and the principles of a human right, of democratic. There is some way and possibility for a justice. Don't go to extremism, to violence. Don't feel that nobody cares about your suffering. Otherwise, we will lose all the benefit, all the principles that humanity achieved, especially after the World War II. Here in Germany give a very good example, ethical example for the refugee crisis before. And now again, they give very good ethical example in the justice issue. The federal prosecutor in Karlsruhe accept up to now 3 cases regarding the war crime in Syria happened. This is one of the, this is not the justice we dream for Syria. This will not solve the problem in Syria. But this is a practical example to say that, yes, still we can do something. We can keep believe in our value, in democratic, in human rights. We still believe in our humanity. These cases give this very good and wonderful messages to the Syrian, especially because it's not regarding their nationality. There is many cases in France, but regarding the French victim. Only here in Germany we have this possibility to go to the court just as a Syrian victim. This is very important. This is one of the tools we need to use it. We need to push the new government here in Germany to allow the federal prosecutor to do their duty, to give them the facility and what they need to achieve this kind of message of responsibility. I think in general, all of you knew a lot about the crisis in Syria and what happened. But especially for the youth who live in Syria still now, in al-Ghouta by example, they feel that all these talk about the human right and democratic, all these years and years listening to the free country, the foreign country, liberal country, it's only a propaganda. They lose their respect or belief for all these kind of value. And this is very dangerous. Not for Syria and the future of Syria, but for everything happened. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mazen. Thanks to all of you. Before I give the mic to the audience to listen to their questions, I would like actually to ask each of you a question, if you allow me. I start with you, Nicolas. You tried to be a bit hopeful by the end of what you said. But I want to say that the Islamic armed groups have created a stain to the opposition in the opinion of many Syrian civilians who are divided actually every day. And here I'm talking regardless of the different motivations. The other thing that we know that a similar experience happened in Iraq, and we all see the results today. So my question to you, since you know what's going on in Syria and also about Syria by the international community, do you still believe in the the wills of the Syrian people and the ability to come over their sectarian and nationalistic issues?
It's definitely very challenging because, Syria, just like Iraq, by the way, pretty much, may very well have ceased to exist as a country. It is possible. I mean, it's not something that we hope, but it is definitely an option on the table. It is not a scenario that we can exclude because of the size of the gaps that exist at the moment between people. And just listen to Mazen saying, if there is no justice, if there is still this regime, I will never go back. it means that, well, there is a very profound divide, very deep divide. And I would like to just go back to the last idea expressed by Mazen. That is, to my sense, one of the main ideas I heard tonight. That is this distrust that is propagated across the MENA region, but even in our societies, of the democratic values. And this distrust is carried out by both dictators and jihadis, because both say, well, democracy is a scam. And this is something we have to fight for. We have to keep also in the mind of the young generation of Syrians who are becoming like 10 today, are starting to look around and trying to understand the situation they live in, and who know or remember only of war. And people will tell them, well, this war is because some people asked for democracy. So democracy equal chaos. And while it is the exact opposite, I mean, but we have to keep educating people in the values of democracy. Sorry, I didn't answer your question at all, I have the feeling, but are you happy with the answer?
Yeah, thank you so much.
I should have been lawyer, sorry, man.
Bassma, actually, I want to focus on your view regarding the opportunity of the international players today to collaborate with the opposition as the part which aim to solve the Syrian conflict. But I want also to refer to the opposition being blamed by the majority of Syrian civilians to fail actually in the political process. Do you think that you can let us know what are the right tools that the opposition should use now to regain the confidence and trust of civilians and to be able to control the military movement as well? And also, if the position could do both, if this will make them able to convince the international players to collaborate with them?
Look, I think we have, whether it is the international community, I wouldn't say all of the international community, but the countries who have declared themselves as friends of the Syrian people, as well as the opposition, I think we have failed to predict the next battle. We have most often been one battle behind. And the Syrian situation has evolved from one disaster to another. But when you undergo a disaster, and I would say we are currently living the disaster of Ghouta, we don't just go to the international community and yell and whine and moan and complain that a disaster is happening. I started by saying nobody cares. And I want to build on this sad reality. Nobody cares about Syrians. Now, once we have integrated this, we should be looking at the next battle. I think now is a turning point for us to think about the next battle. The Geneva process does not matter. We can go to Geneva tactically just because we want to prevent anybody putting the blame on us. But this is a sideshow, an absolute sideshow. It has no importance at the moment. Every indication goes in this direction. What we need to predict is who are the players that count. My prediction is armed groups are going to be marginalized. Their role is not a helpful role. We cannot rebuild legitimacy, although the legitimacy of the demands of the Syrian people have never been in question, but if we want to give strength to the legitimacy of the people's demands, we should be organizing again the voice of the civilians. Now, civil society has taken an image of these are the nice Syrians who demonstrated peacefully in the beginning, and now they continue to do useful work, which will do some local development and some transitional justice work, and they will be useful eventually. But that is not the voice of the people who are suffering and are victims of powerful players and are left without a voice. This is true of Ghouta today. It is true of Afrin today. It is true of Idlib today, where the population shows it has the resilience, which is the word, the buzzword that everyone uses, but the resilience, the creativity, the capacity to organize and mobilize. Assad may return with some of his supporters to govern certain areas. He has taken back Daraya and Ma'addamiyya and could well retake Ghouta. Now is the time where the opposition needs to integrate some of these representatives from the local civil population, which we have not done. We have integrated armed groups because they were important, but the truth is our legitimacy is not going to come now from armed groups. It is going to come from the demands of the people. So I think there is a change to bring about in the opposition, and I think civil society organizations who exist inside and outside Syria are in a position to build coalitions and say, we will carry the voice of the people from inside. It is local.
Understand, you're talking about civil society also in regime-held areas.
No.
That you would like to include. This is a difficulty because...
Well, we cannot. How can we integrate them? Look, there is an impossibility. Here is also the hypocrisy of the internationals. Work inside the regime-controlled areas. But for God's sake, if ever we...
But this is the point, because the regions, the areas held by the opposition are now shrinking, and soon there will be no one else to integrate from inside Syria.
Look,
sorry for being the devil's advocate, but
no. But I think what we have is that if the military control, if Assad and his allies force the country into submission, the population is not going to stop resisting. Okay, in various ways, and I think this resistance is now our main challenge: is how we allow the population to keep the means to resist, how we help organize it in various ways. And we are saying Assad may win, but he will never be able to govern again. This is where I think the actual work needs to happen now. But at the very urgent and short term, it is Ghouta, Afrin, Idlib, civilian population that needs to be heard and their voice organized and their demands formulated in clear ways and propositions coming from them. Again, the population cannot on its own talk to Russia, cannot on its own in Afrin talk to Turkey, cannot on its own. It needs the support. And those countries that have done so little so far can really be now in a role where they don't need to mobilize armies, they simply need to play a real political, diplomatic role where we cannot believe for a second that they don't have the capacity to have some influence here.
Thank you so much, Bassma. Mazen, of course you're doing great work regarding the lawsuits you are trying to file here in Germany. And you also mentioned the file by Caesar about detainees, which was, it has a special focus, should be by the UN, and also a lot of international experts confirmed that the regime committed crimes against the humanity when we talk about detainees. What I want to ask you, first of all, what are our tools to lobby, to get supported on the media and also politics level? And the other thing, where are the gaps that we have to consider regarding working on such files, even the cases that you are trying to file, or a very important one like the Caesar?
Thank you, Yasmine. Actually, in Syria, we can talk a huge number of very important files. Caesar, one of them, Afrin now, ISIS crime, Kodmani, each maybe centimeter in Syria, there is a crime, and there is very important work for justice. But Caesar photo, there is, it's present on the French authority before 2 years, unfortunately, but the jurisdiction mandate in French not allow the judge to deal in the case if there is no French victim directly. Now, before here in Germany, before 4 months, there is a new original copy from the photo, very good resolution, sent to the federal prosecutor, and they start their investigation. The jurisdiction, universal jurisdiction here in Germany, it's more open, so we hope that, let me say, not soon, but it's in the process, and there is some result can be achieved here in Germany. But in Syria, as I said, there is, in any place, in anywhere, there is no lack in evidence or in witness or victim. This is maybe, as I know, the most war which documented, and the crime, it's you can see it live through the TVs. It's, there is no lack in the evidence or said victim or documentation, but there is really the political willing. This is one of the gap. There is the Russian, which has said before that they are part from this crime. So now they usually before in 2011 and later they use veto to protect the regime. But now they use veto in this field to protect themselves. So they are part from this crime. This is one, and as we know, Syria is not signed Rome status, so we can't go directly to ICC without an order from the Security Council. But last year, there is also very good example happened in the General Assembly of the United Nations, while there is a decision to have the triple IM. It's not a court, it's some kind of investigation body, repair the files and collect the evidence to send it to the court. And now they are in cooperation here in Germany, in France, and many countries regarding these cases happen. This is not enough, but this is an example that even with the veto, still there is something we can do. Maybe this in September, we have a try next September in the ONGA to achieve some kind of resolution to transfer or to build a special court or tribunal for Syria. Maybe it's have 10% to succeed this year, but should keep working in this regarding. The political situation maybe change after 5 years, 10 years, the Russian, Putin, all these things. The most important, as I believe, that to keep fighting for justice. This is, last year maybe some of the audience here was with us when we have the press conference for the first case some of the Syrian, or the majority of the Syrian there, and there is more than 300 persons in that place, they are not only happy, not crying, not feeling that they are humanitarian. They feel that there is a future for their children, because there is only a small message about justice. What we want to do, we need to be sure that it's justice not about revenge. Justice very important for the future of our children in Syria and the region, here in Europe. I can't really believe that after all these years and years fighting for principles and human rights, we reach this level that we can't do anything in such crime. And not only this, even awarded those who make this crime and support them to do more and more. This is very dangerous, not for Syrian only. We should, all of us, keep pushing, keep trying. This is what we have to do.
We open it now for your questions, please. If you have any. So we start with you.
My question is for Bassma.
If possible, please to introduce yourself and also name the person that you want to ask.
Yes, okay. So my name is Zara. I'm a trainee at the moment at the ECCHR. And my question is to Bassma. You made the proposal that the Syrian opposition, including the voices of the civilians in Syria, should draft a plan for Syria's future, how the society should look like, as a kind of idea opposed to what is happening right now in the regime. But you also said that at the moment you see absolutely nothing is really getting the attention of the international community. You said the international community doesn't care about the humanitarian situation, it doesn't care about the security situation. How are you going to convince them to listen to you if you have this, this plan for Syria's future?
Do you prefer to, yeah.
I think we have, yes, we have the huge disappointment of no interest in the humanitarian suffering or the security situation, which has been handled in a very, very narrow approach of, as you may know, when each country had, an attack by ISIS on its territory, whether it was France or Britain or the US, particularly the Europeans, they would go and strike one group in Raqqa, which they had intelligence about, and that this particular group included some jihadis of British origin, of British citizenship or French citizenship, okay? So the narrow approach was ridiculously inefficient. And the Syrians themselves were saying, we wish the countries at least were serious about fighting terrorism. So you are right, there was no seriousness in dealing with anything. Now, Syria is a complex place, and I believe not many countries understand what is going on. And I don't think any country has any idea about what the solution should be. The level of division among Syrians is something that needs to be analyzed in a much more subtle way to understand whether there is space for reconciliation or not. I claim there is. And I claim it is much easier to reconcile Syrians than people believe, provided Assad is not in the way, because he is the one actively preventing it from happening. I fear a solution that would be like Bosnia, where a ceasefire was imposed plus an agreement which basically froze the political situation and did not give the Bosnians a real solution. And Bosnia lives from 20 years, 20-something years now, under an agreement that is dysfunctional, a political system that doesn't work. Why? Because they themselves, Bosnians, have told us, we spent 5 years moaning and yelling that we were the victims and that the Serbs were killing us and that we were suffering, etc., instead of preparing the actual alternative. And the moment the international community decided this was the end of the Bosnian War, they wanted an end to it, they came and said, okay, in 3 weeks we draft an agreement for them and we simply impose it. And they suffer from an agreement that they never discussed. I think this is the case of Iraq, of course, which was submitted. Iraqi civil society has organized a parliament of civil society, and intellectuals come out and publish petitions signed by thousands of people, and it doesn't count because today the situation is dominated by armed groups, Iran, US, and as we know, and ISIS before that. So the biggest challenge today is to get Syrian civil society, population, as well as Syrian intellectuals, political minds to come together and prepare what would work for Syria. Are Kurds and Arabs impossible to reconcile? Is this a reality? Are Alawis and Sunnis not going to live together? I don't know if we are going to give in to this narrative. So I'm saying we need to come up with what looks feasible and livable and viable in Syria. Nobody else will do it for us.
Thank you, Bassma. There were hands raised maybe in the back. We listen to you, Kristin, and then we get back to the hands.
Thank you. I'm Kristin Helberg. I'm a freelance journalist working on Syria. I was talking before you about several things, and I agree about a lot of things. I have a question for Bassma Kodmani, if you allow. I very much agree that if we want to regain credibility, it's not through the armed groups right now. I think this phase is over, and I would agree even to say that let's give up arms because it doesn't lead us to anywhere. So my question is that at the same time you were saying that obviously under regime control you cannot have any, civil engagement and civil activities. So my question is, considering the fact that the space for civil engagement is shrinking day by day, considering the fact that whoever leaves Ghouta now and was involved in some kind of local council or activity there can only hold up a Bashar al-Assad poster to stay alive, or he will maybe be arrested or what have you. So considering the fact that, this space is just not visible or viable anymore to the future, I mean, the same will go for Idlib. I don't really see this space, and it's again too late, too late to just, try to rebuild this civilian activity. So my question is, where do you draw your optimism from it, or what would you imagine as concrete measures, to make the demands of the people more visible or to give them a voice externally? I mean, I wish the opposition had done so before in a more adequate way, but what gives you the hope that now there would be the space to do so? What do you imagine the people on the ground to do once they fall under Assad rule again? And this is probably what's going to happen during the next months.
Look, I think for a while the areas that are forced to surrender have little energy to come out in the streets and demonstrate again and say they don't want Assad. That is not going to happen. The price has been much too high. But I think that those who are in areas where they can, whether they are inside or outside Syria, can continue to express the demands of this population and of the activists. Because you don't, of course, look at a civil population that has been completely crushed by bombings over weeks and months and years to say, do they still have the will to do something or not? But you look at those activists who are forced to leave the areas. As you know, they can't stay. Even if they raise Assad's portraits, they're not going to be believed. They will still be chased and suppressed. So these people are asking to leave, and they are leaving. And they're moving from one area to another. They are in Idlib today. And then, of course, many of them are outside in the neighboring countries. You also have the northeastern area, which is an unknown, which is an area that is simply signaling to Assad and to Russia and to Iran, the game is not over. This area may still change the equation. As opposition, I believe we should be looking at what to do to contribute to the change of equation, starting from areas that are not under the regime's control. So I think it requires. I'm not being, in a romance of people rising up against Assad tomorrow morning. They will not do that. They want their lives back and their children back safely. But I'm saying. There are enough people in other areas of Syria and outside who have the means to support and to formulate demands and to build alliances and to work because I think the countries have, although they are not interested in civilian suffering, are interested in having chunks of the strategic assets that Syria represents. Because Syria is a major strategic asset after all. It is a pivotal country, everybody understands it, and everybody wants a piece of the strategic asset. And I think that it's which game we play in that strategic, in these strategic changes that are taking place at the moment. I think it is far from over, and I believe that we need to take a different posture now in order to understand what kind of alliances would work. But it requires a change of attitude, and it requires some independence of decision, because we could be blocked by certain countries who pretend to be our friends and allies and protectors, and sometimes they are hindering some of the strategies that we need to go for. I can't say more than that explicitly, but I think there is a lot we can do if we liberate ourselves from the old patterns. That's why I say one battle behind, always. We need to look forward. As to the armed groups, you are right, and we agree. But I think what we should be looking at today is to say armed groups are already in a crisis, existential crisis. What is their future? What will they do? What will they become? They've sacrificed everything. They have engaged their lives on a certain track, and it's a dead end today. If we don't address today what these guys, how they will live, and how they should live today, not tomorrow, today, then we have a major not spoiler, I don't want to call them spoilers, but a major obstacle to reaching reasonable arrangements on the ground.
Thank you, Bassma. Actually, I'm taking a question by another question because we have time, so I'm trying just to give you time and also give the speakers the time to answer. Yes, please. Oh, there was a hand raised. Yeah, please.
Yes, sorry, it's again a question for Bassma Kodmani, but I'm a bit puzzled when you speak of giving up arms. And at the same time, you say that you should rely on this remaining civil society in certain parts of Syria. And I'm sorry if tonight I sound like the spokesman of the Free Syrian Army, which I'm not. But the only thing the only reason for which there is still some remnants of civil society in some parts of Syria is that because there are men with guns standing between them and the regime or the jihadis. So how can you say give up giving up arms, and then no. But if you completely give up arms, unless you have international protection, Turkish one, for instance, with some countries or strings attached, to put it mildly, there's no longer any civil society to do, anything. And you should certainly not rely on Western protection, because that's not something that exists. So I think you're stuck with the men with guns, with all their flaws.
Very quickly, I think we failed in Aleppo, we are failing in Ghouta, and we will continue to fail if we go for the pattern of armed groups should be the ones negotiating and deciding the future of these areas. I think the armed groups, again, should be pushed themselves to propose themselves as security forces for the areas that they control in exchange for putting away heavy weaponry and getting international guarantees on ceasefire. Now, with that, you can go and ask for guarantees of ceasefire lines. No, but of course, then we are living in a okay.
So can I just? I mean, we see clearly the only kind of guarantee that works is foreign boots on the ground. In this, until now, Turkish or U.S. I mean, there is no such thing as international guarantees without enforcement, and we've seen it, and we know that if they give up heavy weapons, and if there was no foreign boots on the ground between them and the regime will violate, and the Russians will violate. They will lie. They will tell you, oh, we agree to ceasefire, and then the next month, when they have the manpower for it, they will destroy it. So, I mean, I think that would be completely suicidal. I'm sorry.
I think we have not tried it.
You shouldn't.
I'm sorry. I think we are losing everything, including civilian institutions in those areas, because they are being wiped off together with the armed groups. And I think we should have defended those civil institutions and asked the armed groups to serve as security forces and be recognized as security forces. It was a different kind of a political battle, but we should have fought this battle. But the armed groups have not cooperated enough to allow us to propose something like this. Instead, they are negotiating their own departure.
Who prevents the regime from retaking these areas?
You're talking to the international, UN, Russia, and other countries. You get de-escalation when they want, they commit to it. You get the other countries to ask for it. But we haven't done that. So I think we are losing everything, and perhaps we could have protected at least the civil institutions.
I come to you, but Yassin has a comment. So. Sorry.
Nicolas, how come that you were abducted by Daesh? You spent almost a year, and you come and you are still against our secular regime instead of focusing against the jihadis.
Just because I didn't bought the legend.
What legend?
I didn't buy the legend. The regime tries to do that they are secular, and that they are actually fighting the jihadis. I mean, I have been abducted by the creators of the regime. That's it.
Yeah. Can I come to you, please? Okay. بس لو سمحت ياسين المايك للصف الرابع.
Over the last 7 years, there have, of course, been pockets where an interim government has been set up in Syria. And are there any models of successful government, even though, of course, they had to be protected and had to fight on a daily basis for survival? But, for example, in the free city of Daraa, there was something like an interim government. And could these models serve somehow for the future? That's my first question for Bassma again. And my second question is, today was, and yesterday was the 7th anniversary of the revolution, for the beginning of it. And we staged, I'm a theatre director and activist, and we staged a symbolic Hague trial of Putin and Bashar al-Assad. We've got tired waiting for this trial to take part for crimes against humanity or crimes against society, as you called it. How long is it going to take before they're brought to justice, not just in Karlsruhe, but in The Hague? And what will have to happen to make that possible? Thank you very much.
Your question is to Mazen, the second
The
question.
second one to
And
Mazen,
your name?
Thank you. Sorry, Rachel Clark, thank you.
So, Bassma, please.
First question, I think the second is for Mazen and perhaps Nicolas. I think typically the south of Syria is one particular interesting area where civil institutions exist, but where we have stronger guarantees from the internationals to protect a de-escalation zone. So it is supposed to be a ceasefire, an arrangement by which US, Russia, Jordan, and behind them Israel are content with the arrangements in that part of the country, and therefore civilian institutions can, at the moment, survive. The fact is that the armed groups in this area are absolutely not free to do anything they would like to do. They can't move 10 meters if they are not allowed to do so. So they have been practically de facto neutralized. They exist, but they have been neutralized in the south of Syria. So it's not an interim government so much, it's more a local councils that operate, and they have been very successful. Civil society and local governance institutions and authorities have been successful in the south, as they have been successful everywhere. But my problem has been with the association of civil institutions with the military, with the armed groups. And we have not defended, we may not have succeeded. I think Thomas was pointing to, yes, these armed groups are the only guarantee for not having the regime step in again. But in fact, they have not. In the end, ultimately, these armed groups could not resist when the regime decided to take back these areas. Therefore, they were not the actual protection that we would have hoped they could be. And so, was there a possibility to defend fully a civilian, the civil players, because the armed groups are unpopular, and they are the regime's best alibi, and they are the Russians' target, and they are the international community's embarrassment. They don't like them, and therefore it may also have contributed to the fact that the international community is not doing much for Syrians, because many of these armed groups have also refused to dissociate themselves very clearly from radical groups and Nusra and others. And that has happened in different areas of Syria. I am not blaming them. I know there are wonderful people in these groups, wonderful people who understand everything and who themselves understand that now is a time to change strategy. So there are people who have integrated the changes that have occurred. But I continue to say the only game we can play now is this one. We have no other game to play. It's worth trying.
When it's not tomorrow, for sure, but justice in general, it's take time. So in Bosnia, by example, it took more than 20 years to see in The Hague some result and to see the court do something. But the problem in Syria, it's the crimes still daily happen. Now, while we are talking here, there is a war crime and crime against humanity happen. Does this mean that we don't have a kind of luxury to wait more and more and to spend more years? I think yes, but what we can do, we need to start from even a small point, like these cases in Karlsruhe in France, pushing with the General Assembly, like what happened with the IIIM. In the end, I believe that we will have justice in Syria. Not this romantic way with each crime and each one he made any crime, he will go to the court or see him in the prison. even in Syria, I don't know if this is the way for the solution. We need long-term strategy. We need a Syrian form and process for transitional justice, clever, make balance between the need also of the reconciliation in the society, and have real justice, not as now in the United Nations or many other places talking about general mercy. All the Syrian evil and all of them make violence, and it's not important how and where. This is, we hear this from even the European Union, unfortunately, this kind of messages. But we don't have any choice. Keep fighting to achieve justice. Maybe after 5 years, 10 years, as I said, the political situation will change and we can build. As Bassma said for Dayton, about Dayton, what happened in Bosnia, we don't want to need to reach this change to start. We need to start from, not now, even from the first day, repair ourselves, put strategy, make documentation, and I think we have very good work regarding this in Syria in general. A lot of civil society organization work and a lot of human rights defender through last 7 years make a huge effort in this, in all of Syria.
Just a very short comment on my side. When it comes to persons, I don't think there will be any justice. Bashar or Putin are people that would prefer to die rather than facing addiction. But still, I would like to elaborate a bit on what Mazen just said. You know, justice and revenge are two phenomena, two feelings, or two ideas that are sometimes confused but are exact opposite. Revenge, that's a violence that calls another violence, while justice is just a settlement of violence by putting all the parties together and asking everyone to face his responsibilities, trying to acknowledge who is the victim and who is to blame, and while doing so, extinguishing violence. So even though I don't think there will ever be this kind of trial, I think there must be some trials for the war crimes that are being committed every day in Syria.
Thank you, Nicolas. Mohammad, please.
I have two questions, one to Bassma and one to Mazen. Sorry, I don't want to stuck on this point, Bassma, but because I see your point, but because you are speaking about new discourse, new solution, I would say that let's also be realistic about how we articulate this, because for me, I'm not against it or with it now, I'm just discussing it with you. I would prefer to call it like absolute surrender to the regime, and then we see what's happened, because to say that, like leave this, I mean, to say it in this way, give up arms or everything, I would say the virtue in it, which is very important, is to save civilians maybe, but to say that we can build on that in a way to, how to say, to revive the civil resilience or something, it's a bit utopian, I have to say. And if you are counting on some of the activists that have been there and now will go out, I think we already have loads of them in Europe elsewhere. They flew like 3-4 years ago, and they are everywhere, so you can start working, or maybe you should have started working with them years ago. But I think if we go with this, then we need to go with different articulation. We need to be honest and say, okay, it's an absolute surrender, and we will not start to predict or give any promises, even the slightest promises, and say, okay, let's go back to Assad's dynasty. Sorry, I'm not trying to be cynical. I'm just trying to put it as it is, and then let's see what happens, whether something happens. But to say that, to put it like this, and with the promise that we can work with local agents who will who will like flee these areas with energy or with a voice or with a momentum. I found it a bit, I don't know, unless you can explore, elaborate more on that. And Mazen, I don't know if it's something you can speak about or not, but I'm really curious, and I think some of the audience members also, to know more about the practical aspect of the process here in Germany, the cases, what are the next steps, and what is the expected objective on maybe from the legal point of view, like if we can put it more precisely. Because it's something, as you said, one of the few things that have weight and meaning today to do while in the diaspora or while in such difficult times where really only few things can have any concrete meaning. Thank you very much.
If you don't mind, we have Enrico and Rias. We take your questions and then we answer them. Okay.
Yeah, actually, Enrico De Angelis, my question was very similar. It was also an observation to what Mohammad and also Thomas a bit just said. I mean, that in the end, to think about revival and of this deus ex machina, let's say, of the civil society after 7 years of conflict can be possible only if there is before a kind of political solution, which is not, of course, the achievement of the revolution goals, but it's at least a political system where some guarantees, as Thomas was saying, are there, and so we can hope that, again, in these kind of gray areas in Syria, and especially probably, as you were saying, for example, in areas controlled by the regime, which will be very interesting to see what happens. But to wait for this without a political solution before, I think it will be really very, I can't see this. And I was also thinking, we just mentioned about the issue of reconstruction. Now, the reconstruction, of course, is a big leverage that Europe and the US have towards Syria in this specific context, because Russia and Iran, they know very well that they can't reconstruct Syria without the support of the West, let's say. So this is it's a very, very powerful card. In your opinion, can't this be used to reach at least that kind of political agreement, a new political system at least, that with of course, the end of the conflict? Thank you.
I just would like to elaborate on your very shortly on your question. While the regime and Russia and Iran to some extent are now blackmailing the West, the exact opposite. So basically, these guys are beggars. They want us to pay for what they have broken, but they are pretending to be the masters and to say, oh, now you have to reconcile with us, otherwise you won't get stuck, you won't get a penny from the huge business of the reconstruction of Syria. And it's very, it's very telling, the narrative around the reconstruction and the manipulation about on this narrative.
Thank you. Rias, please.
Good evening. My name is Riyad Al-Madhoun. I'm a Palestinian Syrian poet. Dear Bassma, you say we didn't have the chance to try that. But I think we have warning from history. 1995, people in Srebrenica, the United Nations asked them to give their weapons, and they did. And they were under the witness of all the world, and with the 400 soldiers from Netherlands, they turn their background to the people, and they killed around 8,000 people in front of all of the world. And that massacre will not happen if they still have their weapons with them. So, and actually, the regime in that time is a joke compared with the Assad regime. So if there is no guarantee to these people not massacred by a regime, at least they die with their weapons. It's better as I think. And yes, we can't repeat the history because, as Mark say, history repeats itself. First is a tragedy, and this is what happened in 1995, and the second will be comedy.
Thank you, Riaz. So, please.
I think we need to look at the hard reality that currently the weapons have not protected the areas where the armed groups are. And that is not the fault of the armed groups. They were not supported, they were not equipped, they were not organized by any other party, they were not provided with weapons that can stop the airplanes from bombing. All of that is a sad reality. Now, if we have to start from this reality, not from the reality of let them stay with their weapons and die with their weapons. First of all, I am not advocating for the removal of weapons. No disarmament. This is not about disarming. This is about willingly putting away heavy weaponry when the excuse for bombing Ghouta is because these guys are bombing the heart of Damascus. And that drives the regime and the Russians crazy because an embassy has been hit. Okay. You have to measure where you may get some support, some backing for a certain game. The current game of fighting it doesn't lead anywhere. The current game is about losing. Sooner or later, these guys can resist. They resisted in Homs much longer than anybody thought. They ended up leaving Homs and everything being taken away with them, wiped off with them. Okay? And I think because of this reality, we have to look at how we can retake the initiative and be proactive. Propose something. If it is about give up your arms and trust the regime, you can always say no. Of course you can. The groups can say no. The population will say no. Some countries will say no. But if we're not proactive, if we don't take the initiative, nobody is proposing anything for these areas. Nobody. I mean, who proposed something to save Ghouta? Who? Just the countries send long statements to the UN and internationally and to the media to say, let the convoys go in, 10 convoys, big deal. They are not proposing any solution. So I believe the Syrians have to propose things themselves. That doesn't mean they're losing the initiative. I think they are taking the initiative. Reconstruction is an opportunity to change as well. To reverse the rationale. But I think Nicolas is saying something important. Reconstruction, the debate and the narrative on reconstruction can be turned against the West at the moment. What the Western countries are saying is, we have a lot of money, we will not rebuild Syria if there is no change. Now that is not a policy. This is only a position that denies funds to areas which absolutely need it. Instead of saying that, they should be saying, here are the criteria for which we are ready to go in and support reconstruction. It needs to be a legitimate authority, a democratic authority that works in total transparency, does not discriminate, and abides by certain rules and certain regulations and laws. That excludes immediately the regime. But it qualifies those areas where we still have local civil authorities in the areas that the regime does not control. And that is also a way of restarting life in a form of resistance where local development takes place through the right channels, where the population has a say in what happens to the reconstruction funds. I think this is an opportunity, provided the countries do not simply say, we're not going to reconstruct if there is no political transition. To me, this is not a policy. And finally, I want to say there is no hope ever. The biggest utopia is to think that a political process can lead to a gradual transformation in Syria. We are going, I think the political process has one merit. It will put pressure on the regime, put pressure on the countries that support the regime, maintain some momentum until the day, and that's why I say let's build our scenario on paper with different groups and broaden those groups, because at some point, some other factor, outside factor, unexpected factor, will bring about the change that we did not expect. And it will come from elsewhere. But this regime has, any dictatorship, Assad or other, the software does not integrate the factor called reform. There's nothing called reform. They stand with their firm position until they collapse. Have you ever seen a dictatorship change gradually? I don't know of any dictatorship. Look at Pinochet. That is a different scenario. Maybe it would have worked for Syria. But I don't know of any dictatorship that changes. So,
but I didn't mean the gradual change inside the regime. I meant the political solution enforced externally.
Enforced externally, we agree. That's what I'm proposing.
Okay, Mazen, please.
Thank you. About the process, here the universal jurisdiction mandate in Germany, it's allowed for the federal prosecutor to accept cases from victim while there is no direct relation with Germany. There is no German victim or prosecutor, or the crime not even happened in Germany. So through these windows, we, with also cooperation with European Center for Constitution and Human Rights, here a German NGO, whose support Syrian organization and human rights defender to identify some victim here in Germany, and also to express and give testimony about what happened for them. Also, we go through the chain of command of the Syrian security services, and try to also identify the chain of command for each one, for the military security service, or also Air Force security service. We start before almost 2 years, maybe, yeah, March 2016, the first case, which was against the military security service, especially branch 215 and 248, and maybe as the Syrian know, the branch 215 who's responsible for the majority of Caesar photo, which called in Syria the branch of death, while the prisoners tortured until death. And there is some also family of the victim. They are here now, refugee in Germany. So we use this possibility, the law, the help and support from the German NGOs, as I said, the ECCHR. And we brought much as we can evident. Also, some of the evidence regarding some smugglers' document coming from this security service. Some of those whose work before in these security branches also give their testimony. And we took the file to the general prosecutor in Karlsruhe, and he accepted, said that there is legal basis to accept these files. So he sent the files to the war crime police unit here in Germany, and they start the investigation. And also they have a lot of information from the refugees also came to Germany. They check the testimony, the evidence. They took the witness even to their place in Karlsruhe, and some of the witnesses stay there 2 and 3 days. And now we reach the level now, it should be, we will have or arrested maybe minimum for 6 of the high-level leader in this security service. Maybe, let me say maybe, within 1, 2, hope not more, 2, 3 months, something good will be achieved. But again, this is one of the tools to keep this file on the table while all want to ignore it and just to go to general mercy. Other cases also, regarding now we're talking about reconstruction, let me just say that also there is Lavarge case, by example, many other cases regarding the business and the responsibility of the company also through the human rights. Many good initiatives in many countries happen. It's need time, but still this is the most important tools which we have it.
We are still able to have one question. Yes, please, Yassin.
Again, this is a comment. I don't want to open another round of discussion with dear Bassma. Azizti Bassma, the Palestinians did everything with similar logic that you are defending. And I think in 25 years, more than 25, almost 25 years now of the so-called peace process, and it yields nothing. Destruction of the Palestinian cause and destruction of the Palestinian society. So where is the limit that we say, stop it? And we are not complicit in this. Actually, to be honest, I wrote this paper just to say I will not be complicit in hopes or in scenarios or in utopias of holding any hopes on this international community. It's clear, 7 years is enough, I think. So I think time to say we cannot be false witnesses on this process.
But Yassin, I feel I am sitting outside and not suffering. I cannot bear the idea that I am not doing anything. I'm not trying anything to stop a disaster. I want to look back 10 years later, in 20 years, and say we tried everything. It didn't work. But I want to feel that we've tried everything. I still believe today we are not complicit of anything. We are still trying. The Palestinians tried. They will go for a different scenario. They might have a one-state solution. They continue to exist. Civil society organizations, the women's groups, the youth groups, the intellectuals, the universities, the research centers, they still exist. They are there. The Oslo process did not work out. They lost their land, yes. Something else is going to happen. But they continue the fight. Through civil society and politically. Politically, they've been lousy. So have we. We have been very bad politically as well. But I think...
It's not about us and it's not about them, actually.
No.
Even if they excel themselves and did everything in a great way, the enemies are far more powerful when you have Russia and when you have
But I'm
the
not
US.
giving up. I don't agree. I just don't agree to give up. And I don't see what concessions I am making by taking the initiative. I do not see what I am losing by trying still. Why? Am I saying yes to the Russians or to the Iranians? Or what am I, who am I saying yes to the international community I'm surrendering? I don't think I'm conceding anything. I'm losing anyway. Should we stop today and say we've lost? I just cannot bear the idea that we don't do anything. And I still believe Syria is a moving asset, is a moving strategic issue, which has, and you say it yourself, the question of Syria has mobilized an international equation which no one suspected. Well, that's not over. This is definitely not over. And I believe we shouldn't be excluding ourselves from this international game.
I'm afraid that we have to close the session, Yassin. Before I finish, I want to announce that we have copies in different languages of the books by some of our guests here in this room on the corner, this side. And I want you to allow me to thank my guests very much for your honesty and just for being with us, Mazen, Bassma, Nicolas. And I would also re-thank Allianz Kulturstiftung, Mr. Michael Thos, who we really missed today, Katrin Tomanek and Frederike Klussmann for their exceptional efforts with us, and also the Volksbuhne for hosting us. I want to re-thank the guests who spoke in the first panel. I want to thank Yassin and Mohammad for the great efforts to make this event happen. And I hope on the short time, all of you, a strong morning coffee tomorrow and a short day. But on a long term, I hope that the next anniversary of the Syrian Revolution will come with best conditions and bring Syria and all the Syrians, all of them, a chance of survival and freedom in a more just world. Thank you so much, and have you a good evening. Thank you.